Hey there, welcome to Broaderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. Aliens over the desert. The Arizona desert was everything I needed, quiet, empty, and vast. It had been years since I'd settled in this desolate part of the world, far from the noise and distractions of the city. I came here to escape, to find some peace, but I didn't know just how alone I would be. The sun burned relentlessly during the day, and at night, a chill swept across the dry earth, biting at my skin. There was something about the stillness, something unnerving about how the landscape stretched on forever without change. My house, a small, weathered structure, was all I needed. A simple roof for walls and a window through which I could look out over the barren horizon. A few miles in any direction, and the world would disappear. At times, I found myself staring into that empty space, wondering how it felt to live among people again. But those thoughts quickly faded as the desert always seemed to pull me back, its endless expanse both comforting and suffocating. I worked remotely, writing, researching, the occasional freelance job, and the quiet was both a blessing and a curse. The mornings were peaceful, with the sun rising slowly over the distant mountains, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink. But by the time the sun set, the quiet started to feel heavier, like a weight pressing down on me, and I often found myself restless, waiting for something, anything, to break the silence. There were nights when I'd take long walks, the cool air feeling like a welcome embrace. It helped clear my mind, or so I thought. But there were whispers in the wind, or perhaps just my imagination, that made me wonder if the desert was watching me. One particular evening, I took my usual route, heading toward a small hill just past the ridge where I liked to stand and gaze out at the horizon. The last light of day faded, and the stars began to emerge. That was when I first saw it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a star that seemed to flicker unnaturally. But then it moved. Not like a plane. Not like a satellite. It was erratic, unpredictable, as if whatever it was had no particular destination in mind. I squinted, my heart rate picking up, not sure if my eyes were playing tricks on me. I'd seen things like this before, rare meteor showers or the occasional flash from a passing aircraft. But this was different. It felt wrong. Out of place. I stood frozen, watching as the light flickered and darted, its movements fluid and unnatural. There was something unsettling about it, something that gnawed at the back of my mind. For a brief moment, I thought I should run, but my feet remained planted, the sense of isolation wrapping itself around me like a blanket. The wind picked up, rustling the dry bushes around me, and the strange light continued its dance above. It didn't look like anything natural, and it wasn't the last time I would see it. The light I saw that night didn't seem to fit. At first, I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was just a satellite passing overhead, or perhaps a plane flying too high, its lights blinking in odd intervals. But the more I watched, the more I realized it wasn't anything so simple. It moved with an erratic grace, like a firefly caught in the wind, darting across the sky in ways that defied logic. No plane I knew of could perform such unpredictable maneuvers, and the way the light pulsed, sometimes bright and steady, other times flickering out completely, was unnatural. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my gaze locked on the sky. The desert around me seemed to hold its breath, as though even the earth knew something was wrong. The only sound was the whisper of the wind, the rustle of the dry brush beneath my feet. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, just another oddity of the night. The desert had its own way of playing tricks on the mind, and after spending so many months out here alone, I was sure it had gotten to me. The isolation, the lack of human interaction, the silence, it could warp a person's perception of the world, make them see things that weren't there. I had read about it, heard about it. People getting lost in the vastness of these deserts, their minds unraveling under the weight of loneliness. But something about this felt different. I didn't feel the usual calm. Instead, I felt a creeping unease, a sensation that I couldn't explain. It was as if the desert itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. It was nothing, I told myself. Just a trick of the light. I turned to leave, but my gaze kept returning to that spot in the sky, where the strange light continued its erratic path. It was as though it was calling to me, pulling at some primal instinct deep inside. With a hesitant step, I walked back toward my house. The sand beneath my boots crunched in the quiet, and my mind raced, spinning with thoughts I didn't want to confront. As I neared the edge of the hill, I turned once more to look at the sky. The light had disappeared. Just like that, gone. I exhaled sharply, feeling the tension drain from my body, but the unease lingered. It was silly, I told myself. The desert played tricks on people. But deep down, a part of me knew this wasn't over. Something had changed. And I had a feeling it was just the beginning. That night, I didn't sleep much. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside seemed amplified. My mind kept returning to the light in the sky, and the uneasy feeling that came with it. I told myself it was nothing, but a small part of me wondered if I was fooling myself. The desert had a way of making people lose track of time, lose track of themselves. But I was beginning to wonder if it was also capable of something else, something darker. 2 days after I'd seen the lights in the sky, I found myself talking to Lucas, one of the few people I'd ever spoken to in this quiet stretch of desert. He was an older man, a retired mechanic, who lived about 5 miles down the road. He had lived out here for years, longer than I had, and knew the desert like the back of his hand. We often met at the local convenience store, shared a coffee, and swapped stories. Lucas was a steady, reliable man, someone I could count on, especially when I felt the weight of isolation creeping up on me. That day, as we sat on the porch of the store, I mentioned the strange lights I had seen the other night. His eyebrows furrowed as I spoke, but he didn't seem surprised. "You're not the first to notice," he said, his voice low. "Seen him myself a few times, far off, near the mountains. Funny things, they are. No way to explain it." I stared at him, wondering if he was just humoring me or if he knew something more. But there was no mistaking the seriousness in his eyes. He didn't look like the kind of person to joke about something like that. "You think it's just the wind or something?" I asked, my words coming out more uncertain than I intended. "Could be," Lucas replied, sipping his coffee slowly. "But I don't trust it. I've been around these parts long enough to know when something's off. Those lights, they're different. You do well to be careful. Ain't natural." That night, he disappeared. Just like that. I didn't think much of it at first. People get lost out here sometimes, especially if they wander too far. But Lucas wouldn't just disappear without a word. He had a routine. Every evening, he'd take a walk, a habit I come to expect. He never failed to check in after his walks, no matter how late it got. When I didn't hear from him that evening, I tried not to worry. Maybe he'd gotten distracted or taken longer than usual. But when he didn't show up the next day, I felt the first stirrings of anxiety. The desert had a way of swallowing people whole, but Lucas wasn't the kind of man who got lost. I went to his house in the late afternoon, the sun hanging low in the sky. His pickup truck was parked outside, but there were no signs of him. No lights on inside. The place felt empty. I called his name several times, but my voice was swallowed by the vastness of the desert, the silence pressing down on me like a physical weight. The wind picked up as I walked through the house, peeking into rooms that looked untouched. There was no sign of a struggle, nothing to indicate that something had gone wrong. It wasn't until I reached the back door that I found the first clue. A small scrap of paper was pinned to the doorframe with a nail, a note scribbled in Lucas' handwriting, "Don't follow. It's not what it seems." My stomach churned as I read those words. What did he mean? Why would he leave this note? And why didn't he want anyone to follow him? I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened, something far beyond a simple disappearance. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it the lights? Had they led him somewhere? Had they taken him? The desert didn't make sense anymore. It was as if it had turned against me, against all of us. I spent the next few days searching, asking around, hoping someone had seen something, but it was as if Lucas had simply vanished from existence. No one had heard anything. No tracks in the sand, no sign of struggle. It was as though he had evaporated into the air, leaving behind nothing but an empty house and a note that raised more questions than answers. I couldn't shake the feeling that the lights were connected to his disappearance. It felt like a warning, one that I should have listened to. But it was too late now. I was already too deep into this mystery, and I couldn't stop myself from wanting to know what had happened. The unease that had first settled in my chest now gripped me completely. The desert was no longer just a place of isolation. It had become something far darker. The days blurred together after Lucas disappeared. I couldn't stop thinking about him, about the note he'd left behind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the desert stretching out in front of me, empty and endless, as if it were mocking me with its vastness. I couldn't escape a feeling that something was terribly wrong here, something I couldn't quite grasp. The strange lights had never left my mind, but I told myself they were just an anomaly, some natural phenomenon that I didn't understand. Lucas had said they were different, and now, with his disappearance hanging over me like a dark cloud, I couldn't help but wonder if those lights were more than just a trick of the sky. But I pushed the thought aside. There had to be a logical explanation. It wasn't like me to entertain wild ideas. Still, I couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease that seemed to settle deeper in my chest every passing hour. The desert, which had once been a peaceful place of solitude, now felt oppressive. The air felt thicker, heavier, and the silence had become unsettling, as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I could almost feel the land shifting beneath me, the earth alive with secrets it was desperate to keep hidden. It started small, little things, like the way the wind would whip through the dry brush, carrying with it strange sounds. At first, I thought it was just the rustling of the desert plants, but the more I listened, the more it sounded like whispers. Faint voices, too distant to make out, but undeniably there. They echoed through the night air, curling around my ears like a bad memory. I tried to brush it off. The desert had a way of playing tricks on you. The wind, the way it moved through the cracks in the earth, could make all kinds of noises. But as the whispers grew louder, my rational mind began to falter. I hadn't heard anything like this before, and it felt wrong. One evening, while I was sitting on my porch, staring out over the horizon, I saw something in the distance, a flicker of movement. At first, I thought it was an animal, a shadow crossing the sand. But then it shifted again, and my heart skipped a beat. It wasn't an animal. It was too tall, too human-like. The figure was distant, too far for me to make out clearly, but it moved with a strange, jerky rhythm, as though it were struggling against an unseen force. The way it shifted, unevenly, unsettled me more than I cared to admit. I blinked, trying to convince myself that it was just a mirage. The heat, the desert sun, could play tricks on your eyes, I told myself. It wasn't real. But when I looked again, the figure was gone. I swallowed hard, pushing the panic that rose in my throat back down. There had to be an explanation. Maybe it was someone else, another person lost in the desert, or some strange animal I hadn't seen before. But the way it moved, no, the way it didn't move like anything I'd ever seen, bothered me. It left a nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach. The next day, I went out to investigate, telling myself I was being foolish. The desert was vast, and it had its quirks, but it was just the isolation getting to me. I had seen something, perhaps an illusion or a trick of the light. The desert could mess with your mind if you weren't careful. But even as I walked, the feeling of being watched never left me. The air felt too still, too heavy. As I made my way toward where I had seen the figure, a shiver ran down my spine. The sand shifted beneath my boots, and the only sounds were the occasional gusts of wind. The landscape seemed endless, like an ocean of earth, stretching out to nowhere. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't just the whispers now, either. There were faint noises, just on the edge of hearing, like the sound of something moving through the brush behind me, following my every step. I spun around, heart pounding, but saw nothing. No figure, no shadow, nothing that could explain what I was feeling. My breath came faster, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I had to leave. I had to get out of there before whatever was out here, whatever I was starting to sense, found me. I made my way back to the house, my footsteps quick and uneven. The desert had always felt like a place of peace, but now it felt oppressive, as if it were closing in around me. The whispers hadn't stopped. In fact, they had grown louder, almost demanding my attention. They were all around me, carried on the wind, curling around my thoughts like a suffocating fog. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that the desert was watching me, that something was out there, waiting. Something was wrong, and no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't ignore the creeping fear that had taken root in my chest. The lights, the whispers, the figure, everything felt connected, and I was beginning to realize that I might be in far deeper than I ever could have imagined. I couldn't leave. Not yet. There was something here, something I had to understand. But I couldn't help but wonder, was I looking for answers, or was I simply walking straight into the very thing that wanted to consume me? The days that followed Lucas's disappearance blurred together, each one feeling heavier than the last. It wasn't just the isolation that wore on me, it was the sense that something was shifting in the desert, something I couldn't understand but couldn't ignore. The whispers hadn't stopped. In fact, they had grown louder, clearer, as if they were trying to reach me. It started with a woman from the nearby town, Mary. Her house was just a few miles from mine. She was a quiet, kind person, always polite when we crossed paths. I hadn't seen her in a few days when I first heard. People had started talking, spreading rumors. Mary had gone out for a walk one evening and hadn't returned. Her husband had gone searching, But by the time he got to the ridge where she'd last been seen, there was nothing. No sign of struggle. No footprints. Just the wide, endless desert and a silence so complete that it almost felt unnatural. I didn't think much of it at first. People get lost in the desert. It happens. But the story didn't sit right with me. A few days later, after an exhaustive search by her family and friends, she reappeared. It wasn't like she'd just wandered off. She came back in a daze, barely able to speak, her clothes torn, her eyes wide with an expression that I couldn't place: shock, fear, something worse. When I saw her, she didn't even recognize me at first. Her eyes were distant, unfocused. She'd been gone for days, but she couldn't remember where she'd been, what had happened. She didn't even remember leaving her house. And it wasn't just Mary. Over the next few weeks, others disappeared. A couple, the Thompsons, vanished without a trace. Then another, an old man who lived even further out, disappeared while on a trip to visit the nearest town. They didn't even find their bodies. They just were gone. And then they returned. Like Mary, like the others, they came back disoriented, confused, as though they'd lost days or weeks somewhere in the void of the desert. But the most unsettling thing was that none of them could remember what had happened. There was no sign of struggle, no clue to their disappearance. Just a gaping hole in their memory and a deep, unsettling fear that clung to their every word. I saw it in their eyes, the same look that Mary had when she returned. They weren't the same. Something was different, something was off. And yet, no one could explain it. One night, as I sat on my porch trying to calm my racing thoughts, I saw something again in the distance. The flickering lights, just like the ones I had seen on the night of Lucas's disappearance. But this time, they were brighter, closer. They weren't just above the mountains anymore. They were moving across the sky, shifting in ways that defied all logic, growing larger, more erratic. It was as if they were aware of me, following me. I felt a coldness creep over me, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. The whispers in the wind seemed to pick up again, like voices calling from a place beyond the earth, calling my name. But I couldn't run. I couldn't leave. There was something I had to understand, something I was starting to suspect, but I wasn't ready to face. Not yet. The next day, I saw one of the men who had returned from his disappearance. He was sitting at the corner of the store, staring off into the distance. His eyes were wide, unfocused. I had spoken to him before. His name was Jack, and he had always been a sharp, grounded man. But now, he was different. He didn't seem to recognize me at first, though we had talked just a few days earlier. His hands trembled as he held a coffee cup, his lips moving, but no sound came out. When he finally looked up at me, his face was pale, drained of color. "Did you ever see them?" he asked suddenly, his voice hoarse. I was taken aback. "See who?" His eyes darted around nervously, as though he feared someone might overhear. "The lights. The ones out there. They're watching. He paused, his gaze flickering toward the desert. His eyes widened, then glazed over, as if whatever he was thinking had slipped from his mind like sand through his fingers. I don't know," he muttered, rubbing his temples. "I can't remember." His voice trailed off, and I knew then, whatever had happened to him, whatever had happened to all of them, it wasn't something that could be explained. It wasn't just the desert, and it wasn't just isolation. Something else was at play, something far more sinister. I left the store that day with a heavy heart. The unease that had settled in my bones had transformed into something darker, something more terrifying. I wasn't imagining things. The desert wasn't just a place of isolation anymore. It was alive, but not in any way I could understand. And whatever force was out there, whatever had taken Lucas, Mary, the Thompsons, and all the others, it was watching me, too. I could feel it now, pressing down on me from every direction. The lights in the sky, the whispers on the wind, the figures in the distance, everything was connected, and I was caught in the middle of it. I didn't know how long I had before the desert would claim me, too. But I knew one thing for sure, it was no longer just the isolation I had to fear. Something far worse was coming. The days after the return of the missing people felt different. The air seemed heavier, as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I couldn't shake the feeling that the desert was changing, warping into something I couldn't understand. And no matter how much I tried to deny it, the truth was impossible to ignore. The desert was no longer just a place of silence and isolation. It was a place of secrets. The whispers in the wind had become a constant companion, swirling around my thoughts, making it harder to think clearly. Every time I stepped outside, I felt the weight of 1,000 eyes on me, though I could never see anyone. The landscape, once familiar and comforting, now felt strange, foreign. As if the desert itself were shifting, subtly but unmistakably, around me. I had always been someone who valued solitude. I came to the desert for peace, for quiet. But now, even in the stillness, the air felt charged with something I couldn't explain. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was oppressive, suffocating, like something was lurking just out of sight. One evening, I decided to take a walk, hoping the movement would clear my mind. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the desert floor. The colors in the sky, reds, purples, and oranges, blended into each other, creating an almost surreal canvas. It was beautiful, yes, but there was an edge to it. A chill in the air that didn't belong. As I walked further into the desert, I started to notice things. Small changes, at first, things that would have passed unnoticed before. The ground beneath my boots felt softer, as though the earth had shifted overnight. The sand was finer, almost powdery, and it seemed to sink beneath my feet with each step I took. But it wasn't just the terrain that had changed. The plants, the cactus, and the scrub brush, all of it felt wrong. Their shapes seemed distorted, twisted in ways that made my skin crawl. They weren't just plants anymore. They had become something else, something unnatural. The way they stretched toward the sky, the way their shadows curled unnervingly around their bases, it was as if they were reaching for something just beyond the horizon. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thoughts creeping into my mind. I was just imagining things. I was tired. The isolation was getting to me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just my mind playing tricks on me. There was something different in the air. The wind picked up again, howling through the open spaces. As the gusts passed over me, I heard it, something faint, just on the edge of hearing. A low hum. At first, I thought it was the wind, carrying a distant sound. But the longer I stood there, the clearer it became. It wasn't just wind. It was a sound, a low, vibrating hum, like the ground itself was resonating. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, surrounding me, pressing in on me. I froze, straining my ears to catch it again. There it was. And then, just as quickly, it stopped. The desert fell back into its silence. But the silence was different now. It was unnatural, thick, as if the very air had become too dense to breathe. I couldn't explain what I had just heard. It wasn't just the desert wind. It was something else. Something beneath the earth, something far older than the land itself. And it was calling to me. My footsteps quickened as I made my way back toward the house. Every sound, every movement around me now seemed amplified. I noticed the tiniest shifts in the air, the flutter of a bird's wings far off in the distance, the sway of the brush as if something unseen was moving through it. But there was no breeze, no reason for the brush to stir. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see something, or someone, following me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, the prickle of fear making my skin crawl. But there was nothing. No movement, no figure in the distance. Only the desert, stretching endlessly in every direction, silent and still. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That something was watching me, waiting. I was hyper-aware now, every rustle of the wind, every shift in the landscape, sending a jolt of panic through me. It was as though the world around me was no longer familiar. It was shifting, distorting, warping into something I couldn't recognize. When I finally reached the house, I slammed the door behind me, locking it as though it would protect me from whatever was out there. But even as I stood in the safety of the house, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. It only intensified. The house, too, felt different. The air inside was thick, and the shadows seemed darker than they should have been. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the walls, felt like something was moving just beneath the surface, something I couldn't see. I had to get out. But where could I go? The desert was everywhere. There was nowhere to hide. I spent the rest of the evening pacing, unable to settle. The quiet, the stillness, was unbearable. Even the smallest noises, the faintest rustle, sent my heart into a frenzy. The desert wasn't just a place of isolation anymore. It was alive. And whatever was out there, whatever was hiding just beyond the horizon, was getting closer. It was only a matter of time before it found me. And there would be no escaping it. The feeling of being watched didn't fade after I locked myself inside that night. It only grew stronger. It started with the smallest things, things I might have brushed off in the past, but now felt heavy with meaning, laden with unease. At first, it was a rustle in the corner of the room, as though someone, or something, was moving in the shadows. It wasn't the wind. I had checked the windows, the doors. Everything was sealed tight. But there it was again. A sound, just barely perceptible, as though something were brushing against the walls, just out of sight. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up every time it happened, but when I looked around, there was nothing there. Nothing visible. But the shadows, they weren't right. It was like they were shifting when they shouldn't have been. The angle of the light from the lamp on the table cast strange forms across the floor, tall, thin shapes that stretched unnaturally long, curling into odd positions before snapping back to their original shape. It was like the very light had become twisted. My eyes were playing tricks on me, or so I tried to tell myself. The following morning, things escalated. As I was brewing coffee, the front door creaked open. I hadn't heard anyone come up the porch, and the door wasn't fully closed the night before. But it shouldn't have opened like that. The wind hadn't been strong enough to push it, and I definitely didn't leave it ajar. I stepped cautiously toward the door, heart pounding in my chest, but there was no one there. Just the desert, silent and empty as always. I forced myself to dismiss the incident as a freak occurrence. Maybe I had forgotten to close it fully. But it didn't sit right with me. Something inside felt wrong. Later that day, I ventured out to gather some supplies. As I walked around the edge of the property, I heard it again, faint at first, but growing louder as I approached the back of the house. A soft, rhythmic thumping, like footsteps. But no one was there. I froze, my heart racing. The sound didn't stop, it came closer. I scanned the horizon, but the only movement was the wind pushing dust across the ground. Still, the noise persisted, a steady thump-thump-thump that felt deliberate, like someone was trying to get my attention. I couldn't explain it. My instinct screamed at me to run, to get inside, but my feet were rooted to the ground. I started walking slowly toward the sound, but the moment I took a step forward, it stopped. Dead silence. I stood there for a long moment, too afraid to move. The hairs on my arms stood up, and I felt that familiar, unsettling sensation again, that I was being watched. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone behind me. But nothing. By now, I was starting to question my sanity. Maybe I was losing touch with reality. Maybe the isolation was finally getting to me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just my mind playing tricks. Something was happening, something I couldn't explain, and it was getting worse. That night, after the sun had set and the desert had settled into its usual quiet, I decided to stay inside. I made sure everything was locked up tight. The blinds were drawn, and I even moved the heavy chair in front of the door as if that would somehow protect me. But I knew it wouldn't. Around midnight, it started again. The tapping. Soft at first, like fingernails on glass. But it didn't come from the window this time. It came from the walls. The sound was faint but distinct, like something was gently knocking from inside the house, just beneath the surface. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't anything natural. It was purposeful. I tried to ignore it. I tried to tell myself it was just the house settling, the creaks and groans of an old structure. But there was something about the rhythm of it, too steady, too deliberate, that made my blood run cold. The knocking came in sets of 3, then stopped for a few moments, then came again, 3 more knocks, softer this time, almost like someone was counting, waiting for me to react. I grabbed a flashlight, heart hammering in my chest, and moved slowly toward the source of the sound. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the walls, the floor, the ceiling. But there was nothing. No one there. I checked every room, every corner of the house, even the attic, convinced that if I didn't, I would find something, a person, an animal, some explanation. But there was nothing. Only the emptiness. The house was still. Dead still. I stood in the middle of the living room, panting, my chest tight. The knocking had stopped. The silence that followed was even worse. It felt heavy, suffocating. But I wasn't alone. I could feel it. That's why I saw it. In the dim light, a shadow passed across the far wall. A shape that didn't belong, moving quickly, flickering at the edge of my vision. At first, I thought it was just a play of the light, but then it happened again, this time more clearly. A tall, indistinct figure, moving with purpose, moving as if it knew I was watching. My heart skipped a beat. I knew it wasn't my imagination. I wasn't alone. Something, or someone, was in the house with me. I turned to grab my rifle from the corner, but when I looked back, the shadow was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every creak, every shift in the house felt like the beginning of something I wasn't ready to face. The knocking hadn't stopped, it had simply moved onto another part of the house. Something was here. Something was watching me. And I was beginning to think it was never going to leave. The next few days were a blur of growing unease. No matter where I went, no matter what I did, the sense of being followed never left me. It wasn't obvious at first, no footsteps trailing behind me, no shadows flickering in my peripheral vision. But it was there, just beneath the surface of my thoughts, like a constant hum I couldn't shake. I tried to push it away. I told myself it was nothing more than my mind playing tricks on me. The isolation, the desert, all of it could warp perception. But the feeling didn't go away. It only grew. I noticed it most when I ventured outside. The air had changed. The desert wind no longer felt like a simple breeze, but something far more deliberate. Every time I moved, I could feel it, just behind me, like a presence in the air. The softest brush of the wind on the back of my neck, the faintest creak of a branch bending under weight, it was as if someone was always just a step behind me. But when I turned to look, there was nothing. No one. The desert stretched endlessly before me, a barren wasteland of sand and rock. Yet the weight of invisible eyes bore down on me like a tangible force. I couldn't stand still for long anymore. I'd find myself glancing over my shoulder every few seconds, certain that someone, something, was watching me. And it wasn't just when I was outside. Even in the safety of my house, I could feel it. That strange sense of being observed, of something lurking just out of sight. The shadows seemed to bend and stretch in ways that defied logic, as if they were alive, waiting to engulf me. It wasn't just paranoia. I could hear things, small, almost imperceptible noises that were out of place. A faint rustling, like something moving just behind me, only to disappear when I turned around. I could never quite catch the source. It was as though the world itself had become distorted, playing tricks on my senses. One evening, I sat at the kitchen table, trying to force myself to focus on something, anything, that would keep my mind off the creeping dread. The room was dimly lit by the single lamp above, the desert outside casting long, stretching shadows against the walls. It was too quiet. Too still. And then I heard it. A soft tap. So faint, I almost convinced myself it was the wind, the house settling, a normal sound in an old building. But no, this wasn't right. It wasn't just a sound. It was intentional. Deliberate. A tap, and then a pause. Another tap. And then silence. My pulse quickened. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside the house, just beyond the wall that separated the kitchen from the living room. Slowly, I rose from the table, every muscle in my body tense. I could feel my breath catch in my throat. The air felt thick, as though it had grown heavier, filled with something unseen. I reached the edge of the wall, my eyes darting toward the darkened hallway. The house was silent again, too silent. My heartbeat seemed to echo in the stillness, and that strange sense of being followed pressed in on me from all sides. There was nothing there. I exhaled sharply, trying to steady myself. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe it was just the wind again, playing tricks with my mind. Maybe the house was just old, creaking in the dark. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself of that, the feeling remained, an oppressive weight pressing down on me, as though something was just out of view, tracking my every movement. I couldn't escape it. The nights became the worst. As I lay in bed, the sense of being followed was overwhelming. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel the invisible presence drawing closer, like something was lurking just beyond the veil of sleep. I would open my eyes to see nothing but darkness, but the air felt wrong, charged with an energy that I couldn't understand. And it wasn't just the feeling of being watched. I began to hear things, too. Soft whispers, like voices carried on the wind, though the windows were shut tight. Sometimes it was a murmur, too faint to make out, just a word or two that seemed to echo in my mind. Other times it was laughter, low, guttural, the kind of laugh that crawls under your skin and sends shivers down your spine. I tried to block it out, tried to drown it with thoughts of anything else. But it was no use. The sensation was inescapable. Every step I took, every move I made, it was there, trailing behind me, just out of sight. It felt like I was living in a nightmare, one where there was no waking up. The desert outside had become a prison, and I was its captive. I couldn't trust my own senses anymore. Every shadow seemed to have a life of its own. Every gust of wind felt like a whisper in my ear. And the worst part? I wasn't sure who or what was following me. The more I tried to make sense of everything happening around me, the deeper I sank into confusion. The growing sense of dread had consumed me. Each day, I felt myself unraveling, my thoughts clouded by a relentless anxiety I couldn't escape. It wasn't just the physical sensations anymore, the feeling of being watched, followed, or listened to. It was a creeping sense that everything I knew, everything I had trusted about the world, was slipping away. I couldn't pinpoint the moment it started, but I was no longer able to trust anything. The landscape outside, the familiar desert stretches I had lived alongside for months, had become distorted. The hills that once felt like quiet sentinels now seemed to loom over me like oppressive shadows, bending under the weight of something unseen. The sun rose and set, but the patterns didn't feel right anymore, too harsh, too dim, like the light itself was flickering between worlds. I began to keep a journal, trying desperately to hold on to something solid. But every time I wrote down the day's events, I found myself questioning them as soon as I read them back. The words felt foreign, out of place. There was a growing sense of disconnection, as if I were writing about someone else's life, someone else's experience of this place, of this strange and hostile environment. My handwriting had changed, too. It had started out neat, structured, but now it was erratic, scratched, jagged lines that didn't make sense. I couldn't stop myself. It was like I was being pulled into this madness, as though the act of writing was part of the process, part of a pattern I couldn't understand. I tried to break it down rationally, piece by piece. Maybe the isolation was starting to take its toll. Maybe the heat, the silence, was warping my perception. The wind would play tricks on me, swirling dust and sand into the air, making everything seem hazy, surreal. I had to focus, had to force myself to remain grounded. But the more I fought against the dread, the more it seemed to consume me. One afternoon, as I walked to check the small shed behind the house, I noticed something that struck me like a punch to the gut. A footprint, clear, fresh, and unmistakable, pressed into the sand. But there was no one around. There hadn't been anyone near that shed for days. My pulse quickened as I crouched down to examine it. It was large, almost too large for a human foot. The shape was wrong, more elongated, with an unnatural arch, as though it were made by something that didn't walk the same way we did. I stood up quickly, scanning the horizon, but there was nothing. The desert stretched out before me, empty and indifferent. But I felt the dread in my gut deepen. My mind raced with questions, but no answers came. Could it have been an animal? A person? But I had heard nothing. No rustling of leaves, No sound of footsteps approaching. I hurried back to the house, the sensation of being followed creeping back in. It wasn't just a fear that clung to me now. It was something darker, something that felt beyond my understanding. The feeling that I wasn't alone, that I hadn't been alone for a long time. That night, as the darkness closed in, the feeling of dread grew worse. It was no longer enough to sense the presence around me. I could hear it now. Faint whispers, just beyond my hearing, slipping in between the cracks of my consciousness. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. There was something mocking in those whispers, something that pulled at the edges of my sanity. I spent hours pacing the small confines of the house, my eyes flicking toward every shadow, every movement. The walls felt like they were closing in on me, and the silence that had once been so peaceful now pressed in on me like a physical weight. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, the dread would rise, clawing at my thoughts. I would see glimpses of things, shapes in the corners of my vision that vanished the moment I looked directly at them. At first, they were fleeting, a fleeting figure, a shadow that scurried just out of view. But as the nights wore on, they became more persistent. I would lie in bed, staring into the darkness, certain that something was waiting there, watching me. The worst part wasn't the visions themselves, it was the way they made me feel. The sense that I wasn't just being observed. I was being studied, watched in a way that wasn't natural. It was as if something far beyond my understanding, was learning from me, feeding on my fear. I tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself that I was simply losing touch with reality. But it was impossible to shake the feeling. I wasn't alone. I wasn't imagining things. There was something out there. Something waiting. The next morning, after another sleepless night, I decided to go out into the desert. I had to understand what was happening. I had to find out if I was truly losing my mind or if there was something in the desert that was making me feel this way. The unease, the whispers, the shadows, they were all too much to bear in silence. But as I stepped out into the harsh sunlight, something shifted. The familiar expanse of the desert felt wrong. The air was thick, oppressive. I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see the barren landscape behind me, but instead, the horizon seemed to shift, a distortion that was impossible to ignore. The world itself felt like it was bending. I froze, the weight of dread pressing against my chest like a vice. I turned in a circle, my eyes darting to every corner, trying to make sense of what was happening, but there was nothing there. Just the endless stretch of desert. Yet, as I stood there, I knew, with a certainty that gnawed at my soul, that something had changed. I wasn't just paranoid. This wasn't just a trick of the mind. Something was happening. Something was waiting. And the more I tried to understand, the less I trusted myself, my senses. Everything felt unreal, like the world was dissolving before my very eyes. The shadows were no longer simply shadows. The whispers were no longer just wind. I was losing my grip on reality, and I didn't know how to stop it. The days blurred together. I could feel the grip of fear tightening around me with every passing hour. No matter how hard I tried to convince myself that I was just exhausted, that I was just imagining things, the unease persisted, growing stronger, more relentless. It happened one night, as I stood outside, staring into the desert, trying to make sense of it all. The sky above me was a deep indigo, the stars sharp and cold, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the world had gone completely still. The wind had stopped. The air was suffocatingly quiet, as if the universe itself had held its breath. I was halfway through a deep, shaky exhale when it happened. A flash of movement, too fast to comprehend, cut across my line of sight, just at the edge of the horizon. My heart skipped a beat, and my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't anything I could explain away. It was something, or someone, moving across the desert at an unnatural speed. I squinted, trying to make out what it was. The figure was dark, a silhouette against the pale desert landscape, but the way it moved, it didn't walk like a person. It didn't run like an animal. It was too fluid, too smooth, like it was gliding across the ground, as if its feet never touched the earth at all. I stumbled backward, my mind racing, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. It moved closer, closer, until I felt the air around me crackle with an invisible energy. A shiver ran down my spine, cold and sharp, and my pulse pounded in my ears. It was getting closer. I could feel it, feel something otherworldly drawing near, like it was pulling me in. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my feet felt frozen to the ground. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. The only thing I could do was watch, helpless and horrified, as the figure came closer and closer, its form growing clearer, yet remaining vague at the same time, like the desert itself was swallowing it whole. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it stopped. The figure paused, standing in the distance, watching me. I couldn't see its face, but the air felt thick with its presence. I could feel it, a weight pressing down on me, suffocating me with its proximity. I was frozen. My breath was shallow. My legs felt like they were made of stone. And then it moved. Not with the same gliding motion as before, but with something far worse. It lunged toward me, fast and unrelenting, and I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed with fear, as the darkness rushed at me like a wave. In the split second before it reached me, I shut my eyes, terrified of seeing whatever it was up close. I expected to feel something cold, sharp, maybe the touch of whatever creature had been stalking me. But instead, there was only the sound of a harsh whisper, a voice that didn't speak in words, but in thoughts. Don't fight it. You can't escape. I opened my eyes, and there was nothing. The desert stretched out before me, empty, silent, still. My heart raced. My mind spun in a dizzying confusion. What the hell had just happened? What was that? Was it a hallucination? Was it just another trick my mind had played on me? I looked around frantically, my chest heaving with ragged breaths, but the landscape remained unchanged. The stars blinked indifferently down at me. The quiet, suffocating stillness returned. I was alone. But I knew something had been there. I knew something had been watching me. I staggered back toward the house, my legs unsteady beneath me. I couldn't stop shaking. I couldn't get the voice out of my head. Don't fight it. You can't escape. What did it mean? Was I losing my mind? I was desperately trying to make sense of it all as I locked the door behind me. There was a ringing in my ears, a buzzing in the back of my skull that wouldn't go away. I sank down against the door, my back pressed hard against the wood, as if it would somehow shield me from whatever had just happened. But the more I tried to rationalize it, the more impossible it became. How could I explain what I had just seen? How could I explain the voice, no, the thoughts that had invaded my mind? Was I going insane? Was this how it started? I could feel my grip on reality slipping, the edges of my sanity fraying. I needed answers, but the more I searched for them, the more lost I became. The desert had never felt so vast, so indifferent. It was like a place where the normal rules no longer applied, where reality itself had twisted into something unrecognizable. I stood up, hands trembling, and moved toward the window. I had to see. I had to know if what I'd seen was real. I pulled back the curtain, my heart hammering in my chest, but when I looked out, the desert was empty. The same endless stretch of sand and rock. No figure. No movement. No sign of anything that had been there just moments ago. I sank back down, my mind racing in circles. Was I losing my mind? Was this all just in my head? But deep down, I knew the truth. It wasn't just my mind. Something was out there. Something was hunting me. And now, more than ever, I was terrified of what I might find. The days since my encounter had blurred into one continuous spiral of fear and uncertainty. Each morning, I woke to the same haunting silence. Each evening, the desert stretching out like an endless, empty void. The whispers in the air never fully left. They clung to the edges of my thoughts, making it harder to distinguish between what was real and what was simply the echo of my own terror. But nothing could prepare me for what happened next. It was a quiet morning, the sun barely rising over the distant hills, casting long shadows across the ground. I had been trying to force myself into some semblance of normalcy, to convince myself that I wasn't losing my mind. I had told myself it was just exhaustion, just the isolation, the vast, endless desert playing tricks on me. Then came the knock. It was sharp, sudden, and entirely out of place. I stood frozen for a moment, unsure if I had really heard it. In this desolate place, no one ever came by uninvited. And yet, there it was again, a series of knocks, urgent but measured, coming from the front door. My breath caught in my throat. Was it someone I knew? Someone from town, perhaps? I hadn't seen anyone in days, weeks even. I moved cautiously toward the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the knob. The air felt thick again, pressing down on me, as if something was about to happen. I opened the door. It was Simon. Simon had been one of the few people I considered a friend out here. A local mechanic, he had a small cabin on the outskirts of town, about a mile from my place. He was a quiet man, practical, with a no-nonsense approach to life. But today, his usually calm demeanor was gone, replaced by something more frantic. His eyes were wide, his face pale, and he stood on my doorstep, hands shaking slightly. "Have you seen Kara?" he asked, voice tight with barely controlled fear. Kara was his sister, the only family he had left in the area. She'd been out on one of her frequent walks in the desert for the past few days, and she had yet to return. At first, Simon had chalked it up to the normal unpredictability of the desert, the way people sometimes got lost or wandered off for a while. But the longer she stayed missing, the more worried he became. And now, with each passing hour, his fear was turning to something more desperate. "No, I haven't seen her," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, though my insides were twisting. "Isn't it a little early to worry?" Simon's face twisted in something between disbelief and anguish. "No, it's not. Kara knows this desert better than anyone. If she says she'll be back in a few hours, she always comes back. But this time, nothing. I've been out looking for her all night. No sign." I stared at him, my mind racing. Kara wasn't someone who would just disappear. She was tough, resourceful. She knew the land better than anyone else. And yet, here Simon was, standing in front of me, terrified that she was gone without a trace. What do you mean, no sign? I asked, stepping outside to join him on the porch. Simon took a deep breath, his hands clenching into fists. There's no tracks. No footprints leading off. No sign of struggle, nothing. It's like she just vanished. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I tried to process what he was saying. The desert was vast, yes, but this wasn't the kind of place you could just disappear into without leaving a mark. It didn't make sense. Not unless something else was involved. Something unnatural. I'll help you look for her, I said, though even as the words left my mouth, a cold knot twisted in my stomach. I wasn't sure if I wanted to find her or if I was afraid of what we might discover. Simon nodded, but there was something in his eyes that I hadn't seen before, a silent understanding, a recognition that whatever had taken Kara was beyond our control. It was something bigger, something darker than we could handle. As we set off across the desert, the silence between us grew heavier. The sun climbed higher, casting long, twisted shadows across the sand. I tried to push down the gnawing feeling in my gut, but it was impossible to ignore. There was a weight in the air, a thick, suffocating pressure, like something was watching us. We reached the place where Kara had last been seen, a small rocky outcrop she often used as a landmark on her walks. Simon paused, looking around the barren landscape, and I could see his fists tighten. There's nothing, he said, his voice barely a whisper. She should have been here. I walked slowly, scanning the area, but everything seemed off. The rocks, the sand, nothing looked disturbed. No footprints, no trace of her passage. I crouched down, my hand brushing the ground, trying to feel something, anything that might give us a clue. But there was nothing. The desert was as still as death. Then I saw it. A small, shiny object half buried in the sand. I knelt down, brushing the sand away carefully, and found what looked like a silver locket. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. There was no mistaking it. It was Kara's. She always wore it. She told Simon it had belonged to their mother, and she never took it off. I stood up, holding the locket in my hand, my mind racing. This was it. This was the only trace we had. Simon, look at this, I said, holding it out to him. His face went pale, and he took the locket from me with trembling fingers. This isn't right, he muttered, staring at it as if it were some kind of omen. I could feel it too, the heavy sense that something was terribly wrong, that Kara's disappearance wasn't just a fluke. There was something else going on, something that neither Simon nor I could explain. It wasn't just coincidence. It couldn't be. There was a pattern forming, a sinister thread tying together the disappearances, the strange events, the growing sense of dread. Something was out there in the desert. Something had taken Kara. And the more I thought about it, the more I feared that whatever it was coming for me next. I should have felt something. Alarm, fear, something. But all I felt was a growing numbness. It had been days since Simon and I found Kara's locket, and yet no trace of her had turned up. The desert had swallowed her whole. We combed every inch of the landscape, every rock and ravine, and still there was nothing. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. But that wasn't the only thing that was wrong. It started slowly at first, small lapses in memory, things I couldn't explain. I'd wake up in the morning, but I didn't remember how I'd gotten into bed the night before. I'd walk through the house, my mind hazy, wondering how long I'd been standing there, staring at the same spot. One morning, I found myself in the kitchen, staring blankly at the sink. I couldn't remember how I got in there, or even why I was standing there. The faucet was running, water spilling over the edge, but I couldn't remember turning it on. I reached out with trembling hands, shutting off the flow, but the feeling of disconnection lingered. I had no idea how long the water had been running, or how long I'd been lost in that daze. I tried to shake it off. The desert had a way of playing with your mind, I told myself. The isolation, the endless stretch of land, it was enough to make anyone feel unmoored. But this felt different. It wasn't just the quiet or the vast emptiness. It was something inside me, something shifting, something I couldn't control. I grabbed my coat and left the house, hoping the cool air would clear my head. I walked through the desert, letting my feet lead me without thinking, trying to make sense of the fog in my brain. That's when I first noticed it, how the landscape seemed to shift and change. The path I walked on felt unfamiliar. The rocks I passed should have been in one place, but when I looked again, they were different, more jagged, more distorted, like something was warping them, shifting them out of alignment. I paused, my breath catching in my throat. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the sand. Everything felt wrong. The air felt thick, as if it was pressing in on me, suffocating me. I turned around, expecting to see my house in the distance, but it wasn't there. The familiar silhouette of my cabin should have been just beyond the rise of sand, but it wasn't. All I saw was an endless stretch of barren land. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and looked again. Nothing. No cabin. No sign of home. Panic surged through me. I had to get back. I had to find my way. I started walking, quicker now, trying to retrace my steps, but the landscape kept shifting. The sand stretched on, the same as before, but now it felt like it was swallowing me whole. The path I had walked moments ago was gone. I was lost. My chest tightened, and my hands began to shake. Where was I? How had I gotten so far? The sun was setting faster now, and the cold night air began to settle in, but the panic inside me only grew. Minutes? Hours? I had no idea how long I had been walking. Time felt fluid, like it was slipping through my fingers. I tried to think back, to remember what had happened before I left the house. I couldn't remember. It wasn't just my sense of direction that was failing me. It was everything. The world around me felt like it was warping, twisting out of focus, and I couldn't trust my own senses. Was I seeing things? Or had something else taken control of my mind? It was as if reality itself was unraveling. Finally, I stumbled upon something, a small outcrop of rocks. I didn't recognize it, but something about it felt familiar. I clung to the thought, desperate for any connection to the world I knew. I sank to the ground, trying to steady my breathing, trying to regain control. But it wasn't long before I heard it. A faint rustling in the sand behind me. I whipped around, my heart pounding in my chest. Nothing. Just the same desert, the same empty landscape. But I could feel it, something was there, something watching me, something lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. I forced myself to my feet, my mind spinning in circles, but no matter how hard I tried to focus, everything felt like it was slipping away. I was losing track of time, losing track of myself. I staggered forward, disoriented, and began walking again, my legs moving on their own. It wasn't until I was halfway up a rise in the sand that I finally realized, somehow, impossibly, I had come full circle. I was back where I had started. The familiar rocks, the same stretch of desert, the same spot I had stood hours before. The place I had been trying to leave behind. I sank down onto the ground, my hands gripping the sand as I tried to make sense of it all. This couldn't be real. My mind was breaking. I could feel it, the edges of my sanity cracking, and I couldn't hold on much longer. The night fell around me like a curtain, cold and unforgiving. And in the distance, I thought I saw figures standing against the darkening sky. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't alone. But when I blinked, it was gone. The night stretched on, empty, silent. The desert was alive with something I couldn't name. Something that didn't want me to understand. And somewhere, deep inside me, I knew it wasn't just my memory slipping away. It was something else. Something in the desert. Something that was taking me, piece by piece. The night after I stumbled back to my cabin, my mind felt more fractured than ever. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was, inside me, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. The desert had taken something from me, something I couldn't quite identify, and it wasn't finished yet. I had no way of knowing how far it would go, how much further it would tear at the fabric of my mind. Sleep, when it came, was a shallow thing. It slipped over me like a cold, oppressive fog, a heavy weight that pushed my body deeper into the bed. I could feel the pull of unconsciousness, but it didn't bring relief. It didn't bring peace. At first, it was just the usual unease, the kind of nightmares you might expect from a person alone in the desert for too long. The darkness pressing on me, the howling wind, the endless stretch of barren sand. But then, it changed. I was standing in the middle of the desert. The sky was a sickly green, not the deep blue I was used to. The stars were too bright, like pinpricks of light burning through the atmosphere, and the air was thick with a buzzing hum that I could feel vibrating in my chest. I turned around, and that's when I saw them. Figures, distorted and alien, hovering just out of reach. They weren't human, but they didn't look like anything I could name either. Their shapes were fluid, shifting, like smoke caught in the wind. Tall, thin, unreal. Their faces were blank slates, smooth, featureless, with only dark, empty voids where their eyes should have been. The buzzing grew louder, a low, pulsing sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once, vibrating the air around me. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my mouth. My body was frozen in place, paralyzed by the overwhelming sense of something terrible looming, something I couldn't escape. Then they moved. It was like a wave, a rush of movement that left me gasping for air. One of them reached out, its hand, or what looked like a hand, floating toward me. I wanted to run, to escape, but my feet wouldn't move. I couldn't move. The air around me thickened, became heavier, and with each step they took, it felt like the desert was closing in on me, suffocating me. The figure's hand touched my skin, and that's when the world went dark. I woke up gasping for breath, drenched in sweat, my heart hammering in my chest. The familiar quiet of the desert was oppressive, too still, too empty. For a moment, I couldn't tell if I was still dreaming. The line between reality and the nightmare had blurred, and I was left with the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I glanced around the room, half expecting to see one of those strange figures standing in the corner, watching me. The shadows in the room stretched unnaturally long, bending in ways that didn't make sense. But there was nothing but the silence. I breathed a sigh of relief, but even as I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The dream, or vision, whatever it was, lingered, like a residue clinging to my mind. It wasn't just a nightmare. I had felt something. A presence. A connection, however brief, with something otherworldly. Something watching. The room felt colder now, the air heavier. I stood up shakily, my legs still unsteady, and moved toward the window. The desert stretched out beyond, empty and silent under the moonlight. But I could feel it, the same strange hum from the dream, buzzing faintly in the distance, like a faint vibration in the earth beneath my feet. I rubbed my temples, trying to clear the fog. My mind was slipping. I had to hold on, had to stay grounded, but it was getting harder with each passing hour. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces, blank, empty, watching. I forced myself to move away from the window and back to the bed, but it didn't feel like my own bed anymore. It felt foreign, wrong. The walls seemed to close in around me, the room growing smaller, suffocating. And then, as I lay there, my mind spinning the fragments of the dream, I heard it again. A faint whisper, like someone calling my name, carried on the wind. I sat up, heart pounding, eyes wide, scanning the darkness of the room. Nothing. Just the silence of the desert night. But then the whisper came again, this time closer. Tom. The voice was cold, disembodied, but unmistakable. I didn't move. I didn't dare. And that's when the hallucinations began. It started with the shadows, twisting, writhing, forming shapes that shouldn't exist. They danced along the edges of the room, bending into unnatural angles, stretching out to impossible lengths. I tried to close my eyes, tried to shut it all out, but when I opened them again, they were still there. And the figures, they were in the room with me. I could see them now, those same strange, shifting forms hovering at the edge of my vision. The figures from my nightmare. I could hear their breath, or what I thought was breath, like a soft, unnatural hiss that seemed to come from all around me. My pulse quickened. I could feel their presence, their cold, empty gaze on me. I turned my head quickly, and they were gone. But when I looked back at the walls, the shapes were still there, just out of reach. A low groan echoed from somewhere deep within the cabin. My pulse surged in my ears. My body was frozen again, trapped in this waking nightmare. The line between sleep and reality had blurred, and I was caught somewhere in between. The figures had come to me, and they were not just in my dreams anymore. They were here. They were real. I tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the void. I had to leave. I couldn't stay here any longer. The desert had become my prison, my mind unraveling thread by thread, and I couldn't endure another night in that suffocating silence. I had to get help. Someone had to know what was happening. But deep down, I knew that even if I left, the desert's grip would follow me. I couldn't explain it, but it was like the very land itself was closing in, pressing against me. Each breath felt heavy, as if the air itself was thickening, turning to lead. But I pushed those thoughts down. I couldn't stay. I had to get out. I grabbed my keys from the counter, my hands trembling as I shoved them into the ignition of my truck. The engine roared to life, a welcome sound in the silence of the desert. I put it into gear and slammed the gas pedal down, desperate to break free from the oppressive weight that clung to the land. As the truck rumbled down the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something behind me, something out of place, something I couldn't name. But all I saw was the long stretch of empty desert behind me, the same landscape that had haunted my every step for days. The road was long, winding through the barren expanse, but it felt like I was being drawn back. Every mile I drove, the unease inside me grew. My eyes darted nervously to the sides of the road, searching the horizon for anything, any sign of movement. And then I saw it. The road ahead, the one I had just driven down, was no longer the same. The turn I had just made, where had it gone? The landscape had shifted, the road narrowing and bending in ways that didn't make sense. The familiar stretches of desert were gone, replaced by unfamiliar terrain, rocks jutting out in strange formations. I slammed the brakes, the truck lurching to a stop as I tried to make sense of what was happening. My hands were shaking, my mind spinning with 1,000 questions, none of which had answers. How had I gotten here? Why did the road change? Was I losing my mind? I put the truck in reverse, hoping to retrace my steps, but the world around me wouldn't cooperate. No matter how far I drove, the road seemed to stretch on endlessly, the same curve looping back on itself. The desert had no end, no escape. I stared out the windshield, trying to focus, but the land felt like it was moving, shifting around me. The sand dunes twisted, rising in unnatural shapes, the air pulsing with a heavy hum. It was as if the desert was alive, breathing, watching. I turned the truck around, hoping to head back to the cabin. But the same thing happened. The landscape never stayed the same. It was as if I was caught in a loop, a maze of shifting paths that led nowhere. No matter which direction I went, I ended up right back where I started. Panic surged in my chest. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't breathe. I slammed my hands against the steering wheel, screaming out into the empty desert, my voice swallowed by the vast nothingness around me. I couldn't leave. There was no escape. In the distance, I thought I saw something move, a figure, small and indistinct against the horizon. A person? No, not a person. It was too far, too out of reach. But the feeling of being watched, of something tracking my every move, intensified. I looked away quickly, unwilling to see more. But when I looked back, the figure was closer. It was unmistakable now, a human shape, standing still in the middle of the road, just ahead of me. I froze. My heart raced as I tried to make sense of it. Who was that? How had they gotten there? The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, facing me, unmoving. I slammed the truck into gear again, foot heavy on the accelerator, but the figure didn't budge. I could see its outline more clearly now, tall, thin, like one of the beings from my dreams. Its features were indistinct, its form shifting, distorting in the heat of the desert. It wasn't human. I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt just inches from the figure. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at it, unable to look away. It was so still, so eerily calm. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. Gone. I blinked. I rubbed my eyes, trying to make sense of it. Nothing. I looked around frantically, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. There was no sign of the figure. No sign of anything, really. Just the endless, empty desert stretching out in every direction. I felt my pulse thumping in my ears, the quiet of the world around me deafening. My hands shook as I lowered them from the wheel, my thoughts racing in every direction. Was I seeing things? Was it real? Had I imagined it? The panic clawed at my chest. I had to leave. But how? Where? The desert was pulling me back. The land itself, the air, the silence, it was consuming me, piece by piece. I knew it, deep down. I couldn't escape. With a final, defeated sigh, I threw the truck into reverse again, the tires grinding against the dirt. The headlights caught the faint outline of the road behind me. The road that didn't seem to lead anywhere. The desert wasn't just a place. It was something more, something I couldn't understand. And as I turned the truck around once more, the world around me began to twist, contorting into impossible shapes, the landscape warping as the figures closed in, waiting. There was no way out. No escape. The desert had claimed me. The truck's engine sputtered as I pulled off the road, the weight of the desert pressing down on me. I didn't know where I was anymore, but I couldn't bring myself to care. Every instinct in me screamed to get away, to run, to hide from whatever was lurking just beyond the edge of my perception. But I had to know. I had to understand. Or else, the madness would swallow me whole. I left the truck behind, the engine's hum fading into the silence as I trudged into the darkened desert. My feet moved with a mind of their own, the sand crunching beneath my boots as I stumbled across the uneven terrain. I couldn't explain it, but something was guiding me forward. Something in the air, a subtle pull that was almost magnetic. It was drawing me deeper into the heart of the desert. The stars above were obscured by a creeping cloud, an unnatural blackness that seemed to have no source. The temperature dropped, the chill cutting through my jacket as if the night itself had teeth. I wasn't alone. I could feel them. I wasn't sure how, but I knew they were here, watching me. The figures from my dreams, the shadows that twisted in the corners of my vision, they were real. And they were coming closer. I wasn't sure if it was the desert itself that was shifting or if it was my mind, unraveling further with each passing minute. But the world around me felt like it was bending, distorting, as if the very fabric of reality was coming apart at the seams. The shapes in the distance, the shadows that couldn't quite be pinned down, they were moving, warping, and I could feel their presence bearing down on me. I stopped in my tracks, breath ragged in my chest. The desert was alive with something unnatural, something ancient. The ground beneath me seemed to hum, vibrating with an unseen energy. I turned slowly, trying to steady my racing heart, and there, just beyond the low ridge of sand, was the figure. The same one. Tall, thin, its shape shifting in the dim light. It was waiting for me. The air thickened around me, heavier now, as though the atmosphere itself had thickened with the weight of its presence. It was so close, so real, and yet still, it felt as though it was made of nothing. A distortion, a glitch in the world. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, choking me, but I forced myself to take a step forward, then another. And then I heard it. The voice. Not from any human source, but from somewhere deep inside my skull. A whisper, no, a command. Come closer. I froze. The voice was not just in my head, it was everywhere. It came from the air itself, vibrating through the very earth beneath me. My muscles locked, my feet rooted to the sand, but I couldn't turn away. I had to know. The figure moved. No, it didn't move. It warped. One moment, it was standing still, its tall, shadowy form looming ahead of me, and the next, it was directly in front of me, impossibly fast. I could see the hollow void where its face should be, empty and deep, like the endless abyss. I didn't move. I couldn't. Then, another voice, this one louder, more distinct, and full of an unnatural authority, spoke. Do not resist. I didn't understand. I couldn't comprehend what was happening. My mind was a tangle of thoughts, spinning, drowning in confusion. But something in that voice, something in that presence, had a power over me I couldn't escape. I opened my mouth to speak, but no sound came. My throat was dry, my tongue heavy, as though I had been silenced by force. The figure loomed closer, its presence overwhelming, filling my senses until it was the only thing I could focus on. And then, the desert itself seemed to change. The sand underfoot felt different, finer, almost slick, as though it wasn't just earth but something more, something alien, something not meant for human eyes. The air buzzed, vibrating with energy that made my bones ache. The sky shifted too, swirling in hues that didn't belong to our world, casting strange shadows on the landscape. The figure, if it could still be called that, raised its hand. I couldn't move. My body had turned to stone. I could only watch as it stretched toward me. A sharp pain lanced through my head, and a flood of images poured into my mind, visions of places I didn't recognize, landscapes of darkness and light intermingled, strange, incomprehensible symbols that burned into my vision. The images were accompanied by a feeling of weightlessness, of drifting, of being torn apart and put back together, of something cold and far away, watching me. But none of it made sense. I reached for an explanation, grasping at any shred of logic, but there was nothing solid to hold on to. My thoughts slipped away like water, flowing through my fingers. The figure was still there, just in front of me, its presence a mass of swirling dark energy. The hum in the air grew louder, almost deafening now, and I could feel the ground trembling beneath me. It was as if the world was shaking itself apart, and I was caught in the middle of it. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. In a blur, the pain intensified, flooding my mind with images of countless beings like the one before me, hovering in the darkness, all watching, all waiting. I could hear their voices now, a chorus of whispers, each one echoing the same word over and over again. Join. The word rang in my ears, a single syllable that carried the weight of the cosmos with it. I couldn't escape it, couldn't stop the flood of thoughts and images. I couldn't break free. I closed my eyes, but the vision only intensified. I saw flashes of the people who had disappeared, faces twisted in terror, eyes wide in fear. And then, in the void, the empty faces of the beings. The aliens. They had been here all along. Watching. Waiting. And I was not going to escape them. A final surge of pain shot through my body, and the world around me began to fade. The ground beneath me disappeared, and I felt myself falling, caught in a void that stretched on forever. When I opened my eyes again, the desert was gone. But I didn't know where I was. I didn't know if I could ever escape. It was happening again. I could feel it, this strange, crawling sensation in the back of my mind, like something was tugging at the edges of my thoughts. The events that had transpired over the past few days were starting to merge, to weave themselves into a pattern. A pattern I could no longer ignore. The disappearances. The strange lights. The whispers in the dark. The visions. The pain. It all connected. And I was beginning to see it clearly, whether I wanted to or not. I sat on the edge of the bed, a dull light coming through the cracked blinds. The desert stretched out beyond the window, an endless sea of sand and rock. Everything felt wrong now, even the air, heavy with an unspoken threat that lingered in the silence. But it wasn't just the atmosphere that had changed, it was me. I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen, the figures, the strange voices, the sense that something had taken root deep inside my mind. And every night, the dreams came again, flashes of darkness, the faces of those who had vanished. Their terrified expressions burned into my memory, like imprints from a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. but it was the visions that had started to make sense. The patterns in the dreams, the flickers of images from the past, the feeling of being watched, all aligned. I wasn't just losing my mind. Something was happening to me. Something was being done to me. I could hear the faint hum in the air again, the sound of something unseen, lurking just out of reach. It wasn't just the desert. It was me. I was being pulled into their world, drawn deeper into whatever was at work in this place. The puzzle was coming together, piece by piece, like fragments of a broken mirror slowly being put back into place. I picked up the notebook from the table, the one I had started scribbling in since this all began. My handwriting had become frantic, the lines of text jagged, as if my thoughts couldn't keep up with the urgency of the questions racing through my head. Each entry was a piece of the puzzle, and the more I looked at it, the more I realized that the answers I was searching for were right in front of me. But I was afraid to face them. The lights in the sky, those strange, flickering orbs, had first appeared weeks ago. At first, I thought they were just some odd weather phenomenon, maybe a freak storm or distant headlights from some passing vehicle. But then people started disappearing. People I knew, people who had gone out to investigate, like I had done. But it wasn't just that. The people who returned, who were found days or weeks later, if they returned at all, were different. Changed. They spoke of nothing, of things they couldn't remember, of places they couldn't name. The stories, the inconsistencies, they piled up, and I began to piece them together. The disappearances were no longer random. They were connected. And there was something, someone, orchestrating it all. Alien involvement wasn't just a possibility. It was the only explanation that made sense. I flipped through the pages of the notebook, the scribbles and half-formed thoughts jumping out at me. The lights, the strange voices, the way the landscape seemed to twist and shift, the figures in the shadows, it wasn't just in my mind. It was real. They were real. The figures I had seen, the beings that haunted my dreams, they were not human. I didn't need to look any further to understand that much. They were something else entirely. Something far beyond what my mind could truly comprehend. But that didn't matter now. I had no choice but to face it. A knock at the door startled me out of my thoughts. My heart skipped a beat, and I instinctively looked toward the window. No one else had been around here for days, not since the last incident. But I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was coming for me, that it had already found me. I stood up, slowly, my legs stiff as I crossed the room toward the door. The silence in the cabin was thick, oppressive, as if the very walls were holding their breath. I opened the door, expecting, no, dreading what I might find on the other side. And there she was. It was Sarah. Or at least, it looked like her. But there was something wrong. She had been one of the first to disappear, her vanishing unexplainable, her return even more puzzling. When they found her, she was delirious, unable to speak coherently. Her memories were fragmented, lost to something that seemed beyond human comprehension. But now she stood there in the doorway, eyes wide and hollow, like she had seen too much, like she had been to the edge of the abyss and returned broken. Her face was pale, too pale, and her hands trembled as she clutched something to her chest. I couldn't place it at first, the object she held, until I stepped closer and saw the twisted shape of what appeared to be an old photograph. It was torn, the edges frayed, but something about it, it felt wrong. "I know what happened," Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse, cracked with terror. "It's not over. They're still here." I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to scream, to ask her what she meant, but the words stuck in my throat. She reached out toward me, her fingers trembling. "They're in your head," she whispered, almost too softly to hear. "They're inside you now. You can't escape." I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. My mind reeled, spinning out of control. I looked at her, but she wasn't the Sarah I remembered. She wasn't human anymore. The photograph. I took it from her hand, my fingers brushing against hers, cold and clammy, and in that moment, I knew. It wasn't just a photograph. It was an image of the desert. But in the background, the sky was filled with shapes, figures, not of this world, not of anything I could understand. And beneath those shapes, a single word was scrawled, almost illegible. "Watch." The word echoed in my mind, reverberating like a drumbeat. Watch. I understood now. The pieces of the puzzle were all there, scattered, twisted, broken. And the truth was more horrifying than I had ever imagined. The desert was not just a place. It was a prison, a holding ground. And we were never meant to leave. I looked up at Sarah, but she was already gone. The door was swinging open, and the cabin was empty once again. I was alone. But I wasn't. I could hear them. They were here. And they were watching. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the barren landscape, but the oppressive weight of the desert's silence seemed to stretch forever. The truck's engine hummed beneath me, its rumble breaking the stillness as I drove deeper into the wasteland, heading toward the town where the others had been sent, the ones who had returned after vanishing. I had heard whispers. Stories. Some said they were just suffering from stress, from isolation. Others claimed it was the heat, too much sun, too much time in the desert. But I knew better. I had seen it with my own eyes. Something was wrong, and I had to know the truth. The town, barely more than a cluster of weather-beaten buildings, seemed like a ghost town. Only a few souls remained, all of them looking as though they had been pulled from the edges of sanity. When I pulled up to the small, run-down motel where most of the survivors had been staying, I felt my chest tighten with a sense of foreboding. I wasn't sure what I expected to find. But it certainly wasn't this. The survivors were sitting outside in a small, grimy courtyard. They were talking quietly, their voices low and scattered, like pieces of a puzzle that had been shaken apart. Some of them looked at me as I approached, but none of them seemed to really see me, not completely. Their eyes were dull, their gazes unfocused, as if they were looking through me. At something I couldn't see. I recognized a few of them, people I had known, people who had vanished and then come back. David. Emily. Mark. They had been gone for days, maybe weeks. Their faces were gaunt, their bodies thinner than they should have been. They looked hollow, as though a part of them was missing. You're here," David said, his voice distant, his eyes unfocused. "We knew you'd come." His words hung in the air, the heaviness of them sinking in. How had he known I was coming? Was I a part of whatever was happening to them? I wasn't sure I wanted to know. I sat down beside them, my hands trembling slightly as I tried to steady myself. "What happened?" I asked. "What did you see?" The survivors exchanged glances, their faces shifting with an almost imperceptible recognition, as though the question had stirred something deep within them. But they didn't answer right away. Instead, there was an uncomfortable silence, a pause too long for comfort. Emily, who had always been the sharp one, the voice of reason, finally spoke. "It wasn't just the lights," she said, her voice quiet but sharp, cutting through the tension. "It wasn't just a phenomenon, something explainable. It was them. They were watching us." She looked around, her eyes darting as though she expected someone, or something, to be lurking just out of view. They weren't just in the sky. They were in our heads. All of us. Inside. You can't remember it, not all of it. But it's there. David nodded slowly, his face slack, as if the words took an effort to form. "You don't remember, do you?" "Not really. It's like parts of us were taken. Like they rewrote us. We were never supposed to be who we were again." The horror in his voice sent a cold shiver down my spine. This wasn't just fear. It was knowledge. He knew something I didn't. Something that I was too terrified to understand. "They made us forget," Emily continued, her voice growing quieter. "They forced us to forget, but sometimes it slips through. The pieces. The things we saw." I felt my heart race, the panic rising in my chest. "What did you see? What did they do to you?" The survivors went silent again, exchanging brief, haunted glances. Mark, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, suddenly stood up, his face pale and drawn. His eyes were wide, almost manic, as he stared at me. "They put things in us," he said, his voice trembling. "Things we can't explain. I can feel them, inside." He glanced over his shoulder as if expecting someone to appear. His voice dropped to a whisper. "I saw them. No, we saw them. The creatures. They're not just in the desert. They've been here, always. And they're changing us." His words hit me like a slap. I looked at him, trying to process what he had just said. Changing them? What did that mean? How were they changing them? I wanted to ask more, but Mark had already started pacing, muttering under his breath. David's voice cut through the mumbling. "They're not from here. They never were. We think they came from the sky, but no. It's not that simple. They've been watching us for so long. Maybe they always have. They don't just observe. They infiltrate." His words sank into my brain, chilling me to the core. Infiltrate. It was like a switch had been flipped in my mind, and the image of those figures in the desert, the shadows, the shifting, the strange alien forms, suddenly seemed far more real. It was no longer just an illusion, not just something from a dream. They were here. They had always been here. "They don't care about us, not really," Emily said softly, almost like she was speaking to herself. "We're just part of their experiment. They come, they take, they study. They don't want us to remember. And they're doing it again. They're doing it to you now." Her eyes met mine, her gaze piercing. I felt a chill run down my spine as her words echoed in my mind. It was as if the entire world had shifted, as if I could see the truth, but the truth was worse than anything I could have imagined. I wanted to argue, to scream, to deny it, but deep down, I knew she was right. It wasn't over. Not for any of us. I stood up quickly, my legs unsteady, my breath coming in shallow gasps. "How do I stop it?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. "How do I get out? How do I make it stop?" The survivors exchanged glances, and for the briefest of moments, I thought I saw a flicker of understanding pass between them. Then Emily spoke again, her voice trembling. "You don't," she whispered. "There's no stopping it. You're already too far gone. All we can do now is wait." The word wait lingered in the air, a heavy sentence hanging over me like a death sentence. Because I knew, we all knew, that waiting was the last thing I wanted to do. But I had no choice. The aliens were here. And I was one of them now. The night felt colder than usual as I walked back to my truck, the sound of my boots crunching on the gravel echoing in the otherwise silent desert. The survivor's words haunted me. Pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together, but they only made the picture darker. The sense of unease settled deeper in my bones, and the feeling that something had shifted inside me was impossible to ignore. I wasn't just witnessing it anymore, I was a part of it. I had to get answers. There was something in the town I hadn't seen, something hidden beneath the surface, and I could feel its pull. The motel, with its peeling paint and flickering lights, had been more of a sanctuary for the survivors than it had ever been for anyone else. It felt like a place abandoned by time, stuck in the middle of the desert as the world moved on without it. Inside the small office, I found a tattered notebook, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. It was buried beneath a pile of dusty maps and old travel brochures, as if someone had intentionally hidden it. I flipped it open, my fingers trembling as I read the first entry. Day 16, they came again last night. The lights were brighter than ever, and the sensation of being pulled from my body is stronger now. I can't remember what happened after I saw them, but I know I wasn't alone. I saw others. I saw us, or not us, not really. Something different. The world isn't the same after they leave. Each entry grew more fragmented, more desperate. The person who had written this was clearly struggling to hold on to their sanity, but what they described wasn't just paranoia or a mental breakdown, it was something real. Something terrifying. I scanned the pages, finding more accounts of strange lights, of inexplicable feelings of being watched, of waking up in places they didn't remember going. But the most disturbing entries were the ones that mentioned the experiments. The idea seemed so far-fetched at first, just a symptom of stress, I had thought. But as I read on, the pieces of the survivors' fragmented memories began to form a clearer, more horrifying picture. The lights aren't just lights. They're conduits, they're doors. They come through the doors, and the entry stopped mid-sentence, the ink smudged, as if the writer had been interrupted. I turned the page quickly, the anticipation growing. The experiments aren't just to study us. They're rewriting us. Memory loss is just the beginning. When we forget, they can fill the gaps. The things I saw, the things I remember, are worse than the things I don't. My heart pounded as I realized what this was, evidence. Evidence of something far more insidious than I had imagined. I quickly jotted down the last of the legible notes and slammed the notebook shut, the fear creeping up my spine. The thought that these beings could manipulate our very memories, erase parts of us, rewrite us, made me sick to my core. I was no longer just a witness. I was a subject. I stepped outside, the dry air biting at my skin, and made my way toward the truck. I needed to find more evidence, more survivors. I needed to know what they had done to me. The question gnawed at my mind, eating away at the edges of my sanity. Had they tampered with my memories, too? Was this why I was here? Why I felt like something was wrong, like something in me had been taken and replaced? As I approached the truck, I caught sight of a figure in the distance, a shadow against the darkness, moving strangely across the desert. For a moment, I thought I saw it flicker, like it wasn't entirely there, but then it shifted again, more solid this time, and I froze. My heart skipped a beat, and I had a feeling I was being watched, as if those same unseen eyes from the night before were bearing down on me. It was too late to turn back now. I reached into the truck for the flashlight, my fingers shaking as I gripped the cold metal. The beam of light cut through the night, illuminating the dusty road ahead. I aimed it toward the shadow, but when the light hit, the figure was gone. There was nothing but emptiness, the desert stretching out into infinity. But the feeling didn't leave. The weight on my chest only grew heavier. Something was out there. Something was watching me. I snapped my flashlight off and climbed into the truck. My mind was reeling, thoughts overlapping and twisting in ways I couldn't follow. The experiments, the survivors, they had been changed. I had to know what they had seen, what they had experienced. The fear of losing my mind, of losing everything, pushed me forward. There had to be answers. But the answers weren't going to be easy. As I drove away from the motel, the shadows of the desert seemed to close in around me, the night darker than before. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being pulled into something I had no control over. Whatever they had done to the survivors, they were doing it to me, too. And I was running out of time to stop it. The memory loss. The strange visions. The growing sense that I was being rewired, not just physically, but mentally. It was all part of their plan. They had come to experiment, and I was nothing more than their next test subject. The desert stretched out before me, an endless void of sand and darkness. The stars above were nothing more than distant pinpricks in the void, indifferent to the turmoil I felt deep inside. It was as if the world itself had turned its back on me. I had spent days, maybe weeks, avoiding the truth, trying to rationalize it, but there was no denying it anymore. The things I had seen, the things I had experienced, they weren't a figment of my imagination. They were real. And the more I tried to deny them, the stronger they pulled me into their grip. The survivors, people I had known, people who had shared the same fear, the same confusion, had confirmed it. The lights, the disappearances, the memory loss, the hallucinations, it was all connected. And now, I was at the edge of something much darker, something beyond human understanding. I had no choice anymore. I pulled the truck to a stop on the edge of the desert, the engine ticking as it cooled, the sound breaking the eerie silence that surrounded me. The night felt impossibly still, as though the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I glanced toward the horizon, where I had seen the lights, the flickering orbs that had first drawn me into this nightmare. They were out there, somewhere in the dark, waiting for me. I could feel it. A part of me wanted to turn back, to drive as far away as I could and never look back. I had considered it. More than once. The fear gnawed at my insides, the fear of what might happen if I went further, if I confronted whatever was waiting out there. But another part of me, the part that had kept pushing forward despite the terror, knew there was no escape. I wasn't just running from the unknown anymore. I was running from myself. The survivors had told me their stories, how they had been taken, altered, made to forget. They spoke of the aliens like they were gods, beings who could manipulate time, space, and memory with ease. I knew they weren't just studying us. They were changing us. They were making us forget who we were, making us forget what it meant to be human. I had to know why. As much as I feared them, as much as the idea of facing whatever these beings were terrified me, there was something else driving me now. Something deeper. I needed to understand. I needed to know what had happened to me, to the people I had known, to the land itself. I had to confront them, no matter the cost. I pulled the map from the passenger seat, its edges crumpled from repeated use. My eyes scanned it, looking for the location I had marked days ago, the spot where the lights had been brightest, where the disappearances seemed to cluster. I had tracked it back through the scattered reports from the survivors, piecing together their stories. And now I had to go there, to the heart of the phenomenon, and face it head on. I wiped my sweaty palms on my jeans and gripped the steering wheel with determination. The decision had been made. There was no turning back. I couldn't let them take me without knowing why. I couldn't let them take anyone else either. I started the engine, the hum of it vibrating through my chest. The headlights pierced the darkness ahead, illuminating the road that stretched before me like a long, narrow tunnel. I drove faster than I should have, my mind racing with fear and questions. What were they? What did they want? Could I even survive this? The truck bounced over the uneven terrain, the desert sand scraping the undercarriage. The feeling of being watched returned, stronger this time. It wasn't just paranoia, it was something tangible. Something there. As I drew closer to the location, the lights, those strange, flickering lights, appeared on the horizon. At first, they seemed like stars, but as I got closer, I saw the shapes moving, shifting in a way that no earthly phenomenon could. They didn't look like anything I had ever seen. They were too erratic, too chaotic. I stopped the truck several hundred yards from the lights, my heart pounding in my chest. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, a primal instinct screaming at me to leave. But I couldn't. Not now. I stepped out of the truck, the dryer cutting through my clothes like 1,000 tiny knives. The ground beneath my feet felt cold, unnaturally so, and the silence that surrounded me was oppressive. Not a sound. Not a single animal cry. Just the low hum of the lights in the distance. I knew they were waiting for me. I started walking toward them, each step heavy, as though the ground itself was trying to hold me back. Every fiber of my being screamed to stop, to turn around, but I pressed on. The lights grew brighter, their flickering pattern becoming more distinct, more rhythmic, like a pulse, a heartbeat in the desert. I could feel the air around me change as I drew closer. It was thicker somehow, charged with static, and I began to feel the weight of it pressing down on me, a suffocating force. The hair on my arms stood on end, and my mind screamed at me to turn back, but I couldn't. I was too far gone. The lights began to shift, moving in patterns that didn't make sense, bending the very laws of nature. I could hear something now, something faint, like whispers on the wind. Words that I couldn't quite make out, but the tone was unmistakable. They were speaking to me. A voice, no, a presence, lingered in my mind, a cold whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. You are not meant to remember. You are not meant to understand. The words sent a shiver through my spine, a deep sense of wrongness settling over me. The alien presence was closing in. And yet, I couldn't stop. I had to know. The lights began to swirl, growing brighter, more intense. I felt as though I were being pulled into them, drawn deeper into their grasp. The air crackled with energy, and the whispers grew louder, clearer. Come closer, they seemed to say. And for the first time, I understood. I wasn't just walking toward them. They were pulling me toward them. There was no going back. The confrontation had already begun. I took one final step toward the lights, my breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps. The desert had vanished into a cold, shimmering fog, the sand beneath my boots no longer feeling real, as if the very ground was warping beneath me. My heart thundered in my chest, but my feet kept moving, drawn by some unseen force, some magnetic pull that wasn't mine to resist. The world around me bent and twisted. The light, once distant and flickering, now engulfed the horizon in a swirling mass of brightness. It wasn't a typical light, no street lamp or car headlight. It was pure, unnaturally alive, moving in patterns that sent a deep sense of unease straight into my soul. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. The whispers had stopped. Now, there was only the hum that vibrated through every bone in my body. It felt like a pulse, like something ancient and powerful was awakening, and I was the one who had come to wake it. I stepped into the circle of light. Suddenly, the world went quiet. The air thickened, pressing in on me from all sides. The desert, the truck, the stars, they vanished. I was no longer standing on Earth. No longer standing at all. I was floating. But it wasn't like floating in water. This felt unnatural, as though the ground beneath me no longer existed at all. I tried to breathe, but the air felt different, too thin, too cold. My thoughts felt distant, as though they were slipping through my mind like sand through fingers. I couldn't focus. My heart raced, but it wasn't from fear anymore. It was because something was wrong, something was terribly wrong. A voice, low and deep, reverberated in my skull. It wasn't a voice that came from anywhere I could see, it came from inside my mind. You have come. You understand now. The words were not a question. They were a statement of fact. And with them, a flood of memories surged through me. Not my memories. Not even the memories of the survivors. These were older, deeper, layered on top of everything I had ever known. Their memories. The memories of the others. Of the beings who had come before. I saw flashes, images that shouldn't exist, sights that twisted my sense of reality beyond recognition. I saw the desert, but it was not the desert I had walked through. It was something else, something darker. I saw machines, sleek, black, and cold, hovering above the sand, their shapes impossible to understand. I saw people, no, figures, being taken, their bodies still, their faces expressionless, their eyes wide with terror. And I saw them, the aliens. They were not the way I had imagined. They were not the classic grays from books or movies. No, they were something worse. Their forms were formless, ever-shifting, like shadows caught in the light, but beneath their shifting exterior, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A hunger. A void. Something ancient and infinite, yet as cold and detached as the vacuum of space itself. You do not belong here. The voice boomed in my mind again, and this time, I understood. I wasn't meant to be here. None of us were. We were mistakes. Experiments. The aliens hadn't come to observe us. They hadn't come to study us. They had come to reclaim us. I felt my mind split. Memories, real and false, battle for dominance. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. The alien presence filled every corner of my mind, crushing my sense of self, blurring the line between what I had known and what was being forced into my consciousness. The flashes continued. The lights. The disappearance of people. The experiments. I saw the process. I saw how they took us, how they altered us, rewrote us, erased the very fabric of who we were. Every time they took someone, They removed a piece, replaced it with something of their own. Memory, thought, identity, they were all tools to reshape us into something more manageable. And the worst part? They had done this for centuries. They were not explorers. They were conquerors. I collapsed to my knees, if that's what it was, knees in a place that had no ground, overcome by the weight of what I now understood. The truth had finally broken through, not just in my mind, but in my body. They weren't here to study us. They weren't here to watch us. We were nothing to them. Just tools in a game they had been playing long before we ever stepped foot in this desert. And now, they had come for me. I could feel it, feel the pressure building in my mind, a strange sensation as though something was invading, filling the spaces between my thoughts. My memories blurred again. Faces of loved ones, faces of strangers. The world felt like it was slipping away, and I was being remade. The things they had shown me, the things I had learned, felt distant now, as though I was no longer sure of where I had come from or who I had been. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. I reached for the memories that were mine, the ones that anchored me to my life before the lights, before the desert, but they were slipping away. You are not meant to remember, the voice whispered again, closer this time, almost tenderly, as if the aliens were showing me mercy. And then I realized they didn't need to break me. They didn't need to force me into submission. I was already lost. The fear wasn't the worst part anymore. It was the realization that I was changing, slowly, surely, into something else. The lights flickered, and as I reached out toward them one last time, the truth was clear. I would never leave this place. And neither would anyone else. We were all part of their experiment. And soon, I would forget. The desert stretched endlessly before me, its barren landscape a cruel reminder of how little I truly understood about my own existence. The sand beneath my feet, the moon hanging low in the sky, it all felt so distant, like a memory I couldn't quite grasp. I had learned the truth, but in some twisted way, that truth was becoming harder to hold onto with each passing moment. The presence, the aliens, had planted seeds of doubt deep within my mind. The flashes of images, the unsettling whispers, they all tried to strip away the essence of who I was, and I could feel myself slipping. But there was something else inside me, a fragment of something strong, something human, that refused to let go. I wasn't ready to disappear into the dark void of my own mind. Not yet. The first step was simple, at least in theory: escape. I had to get out of here. Away from the lights, away from the desert, away from the thing that was erasing me. The truck. The one thing that hadn't yet been taken from me. The thought of driving out of here was a small comfort, but I knew it wouldn't be enough. The aliens had already shown me that I couldn't trust the world around me. I had to outsmart them. Or, at the very least, I had to try. The plan had to be quick, precise. I had no idea how much time I had before the alien influence grew stronger, before I became lost to their control completely. The thought of that, losing myself, becoming a puppet, made my skin crawl. I had already seen it happen to others. Survivors who returned with broken minds, pieces of themselves missing, unable to remember the simplest things. Their minds had been rewritten. They hadn't just forgotten the events of the desert. They had forgotten themselves. And I wasn't about to let that happen to me. I knew the first thing I had to do was get away from the lights. They were the source of it all, the focal point of whatever the aliens were doing to us. But just leaving wasn't enough. The desert was vast, and the further I traveled, the more the influence seemed to stretch. I couldn't escape by running alone. I had to find a way to sever whatever connection they had to this place. I needed to think logically. I needed to remember the patterns, the disappearances, the distortions in time and memory. There had to be a weak spot, a flaw in their plan. I recalled something that one of the survivors had said. They spoke in disjointed fragments, but the important part stuck with me. They're not just in the desert. They're connected to it. To everything here. It made sense. The landscape itself, the strange atmospheric pressure, the unnatural silence, it was all part of it. The aliens weren't just manipulating our minds, they were manipulating the very fabric of reality around us. I stared into the distance, the light still flickering faintly on the horizon. I couldn't get any closer. The presence was overwhelming out there. It would consume me if I did. But there had to be something I could use to sever their hold on me. Some object, some place, or even some simple tool. My eyes fell on the truck. The key to my survival. It was my one chance. I quickly scrambled back to the vehicle, my pulse quickening. The plan was clear now. I needed to destroy anything that connected me to the aliens. The truck itself might be a part of their influence. I could feel their presence in the air, even around me, as though they were seeping into everything. I needed to leave behind anything that had been touched by them, anything that could track me, anything that could link me to the desert and its mysterious forces. I pulled the toolbox from the back of the truck and began to work. I didn't have time for hesitation. The engine. I had to destroy the engine. It was the most critical part, the machine that had brought me here, the machine that might still serve as a link to whatever strange forces were working in the shadows. The plan wasn't foolproof, but it was my only option. I worked quickly, wrenching the components apart, disconnecting wires, ripping out the fragile pieces that had once seemed like the lifeblood of my escape. My hands trembled with anxiety, but I forced myself to focus, pushing the fear down as best I could. The truck had been a lifeline, but now it was a trap. And I wasn't going to let it be the one thing that would prevent me from escaping. The engine sputtered as I pulled out the final component, and I was left standing in the dim glow of the headlights, surrounded by the quiet hum of the night. The truck was useless now, but that wasn't the end of the plan. I still had to escape the desert, and that meant getting away from the lights. But I couldn't do it alone. I needed to hide. That was the next piece of the puzzle. The desert was vast, but I'd learned one thing from the survivors. There were places, deep within the landscape, where the alien influence faltered. They weren't omnipresent. They couldn't be everywhere at once. There were pockets where time seemed to stretch, where memories seemed to hold steady. I had to find one of those places. I gathered what little I had left, food, water, and a few tools. The rest of it, the reminders of my life before all this, were scattered across the truck, half forgotten. It didn't matter. I couldn't afford to be sentimental now. I glanced toward the distant lights one last time. The pulse of energy was still there, faint but powerful. The desert seemed to hum with it, like an invisible current running beneath the sand. But I wasn't going to give in. Not yet. The desert was my prison, but it was also my battleground. And I would fight to the very end. I turned away from the truck, eyes set on the endless horizon. There was no turning back now. The night air had an eerie chill to it as I began walking away from the truck, the faint light of the stars casting long shadows across the desert floor. My plan was simple in theory: find the pocket of resistance, the place where the alien influence couldn't reach, and hide there until I could figure out what to do next. But as I put one foot in front of the other, something inside me began to twist. I couldn't shake the feeling that the desert wasn't just a place. It was a mind game. The first sign came when I tried to follow a straight path toward a ridge that I had spotted earlier. The ridge had seemed like a safe place, a landmark to aim for, something familiar in the vast emptiness. But as I walked, the terrain shifted. The ground beneath my feet started to feel uneven, but it wasn't just the sand, everything was moving. The dunes, once steady and unmoving, now seemed to ripple like waves on an ocean, distorting with every step I took. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. After all, I hadn't slept in what felt like days. The exhaustion was starting to cloud my thinking. But as I took another step forward, the ridge I'd been aiming for seemed to vanish. It wasn't that it was out of reach, it had literally disappeared. The shape of the landscape had changed completely. My heart pounded in my chest. I stopped and blinked, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But nothing made sense. The ridge, the one I'd been sure of, was no longer where I had left it. Instead, there was nothing but a wall of darkness, as if the world had simply erased it. It was like I'd crossed some invisible boundary where time and space no longer behaved as they should. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to remain calm. I knew they were playing with my mind. The aliens. They weren't just observing, they were messing with me. And now, they were pushing me to my limits. I turned around, hoping that retracing my steps would bring me back to some semblance of familiarity. But as I did, the landscape morphed again. The path I had taken seemed to stretch on forever, but when I looked over my shoulder, the truck, my only anchor to reality, was nowhere to be seen. I had been walking in circles. I could feel panic rising in my chest, but I fought it down. I couldn't afford to let it control me. If I gave into fear, I would lose everything. My grip on reality would slip, and I'd be nothing more than another lost soul in this nightmare. But then came the worst part. As I stood still, trying to make sense of the shifting terrain, I began to hear something. A sound, soft at first, like a whisper carried on the wind. My head snapped around, searching for the source, but there was nothing. The desert stretched out, empty and vast, as far as I could see. Yet the whisper grew louder. It wasn't coming from outside of me. It was coming from within. Turn around. The voice was quiet, almost gentle, like a suggestion rather than an order. But it carried weight. It felt like the desert itself was speaking to me. I resisted the urge to obey, but the voice didn't stop. It continued, insistent, growing in volume. Turn around. Go back. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I turned, but not by choice. Something deep inside me forced my body to comply. It wasn't my mind anymore that was making the decisions. I was being controlled, whether I liked it or not. When I turned around, the desert had changed once again. The sand was no longer the dry, powdery earth I had been walking on. It had transformed into something else, something slick and dark, like oil spreading across the land. The sky had deepened, turning an unsettling shade of purple, and the stars no longer sparkled. They swirled above me, creating patterns I couldn't follow. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. I tried to shake the sensation of being trapped in a dream, an awful, unending nightmare, but it only grew stronger. The desert wasn't just distorting around me, it was shaping my thoughts, pulling me into a web of confusion and uncertainty. Time wasn't moving at all. It was suspended, frozen in a moment where every step I took seemed to lead me nowhere. I tried to focus, trying to ground myself in the reality of my situation. I remembered the survivors' fragmented accounts, their whispers of the strange phenomena, the flashes of their own distorted journeys. They had described feeling lost, like they were in a maze with no way out. But the maze wasn't physical. It was in their minds. And now, it was in mine. I had to stop thinking. The more I tried to make sense of the madness around me, the deeper I sank into it. I needed to let go. To stop forcing myself to understand what was happening. I needed to stop trying to control it and instead find a way to survive it. As I continued to walk, I became more aware of the disjointed nature of time. I could swear I'd walked this exact stretch of sand before, but each time it felt like I was a little further down the path, yet also further from where I had started. The distance between where I stood and where I thought I was going was impossible to measure. My steps were echoed by something else, something in the shadows that was mimicking my movements, but I couldn't tell whether it was real or just another trick of the mind. There was no escaping the fact that I was trapped, not in the desert, not in the terrain, but in my own mind. The aliens hadn't just manipulated the landscape. They were messing with my memories, pulling me into loops, forcing me to relive the same moments over and over again. And then, the voice came again, as cold and final as ever. You cannot leave. You were never meant to leave. I stopped, my body frozen in place. The voice wasn't a suggestion anymore. It was a declaration. The desert wasn't just a prison for the body, it was a prison for the mind. And in that moment, I knew I wasn't going to escape. Not from this. Not from them. They had already won. The longer I stayed in this twisted desert, the more I felt like I was slipping away from myself. Each step I took seemed to pull me deeper into a world where nothing made sense, where the boundaries between reality and manipulation had dissolved into an indistinguishable blur. The aliens had me trapped in a nightmare, one that stretched endlessly, shifting and warping until I could no longer trust anything, least of all my own mind. I had hoped that I could find something, anything, to anchor me, but all I found were shadows. Strange, moving shadows, flickering at the edge of my vision. They weren't just figures cast by the dim light of the stars. They were something else, something alive, something that seemed to pulse with intent. I had been walking for what felt like hours, yet the landscape seemed to never change. The desert remained unchanged, stretching in every direction like a sea of endless sand, but in my head, everything had fractured. My memories were slipping away from me, too, scattered fragments that I couldn't piece together. A feeling of vertigo was settling in, and every time I tried to focus, the shadows seemed to get closer. I paused, holding my breath, trying to catch a glimpse of one of the figures that had been following me. I hadn't seen them clearly yet, but I could sense their movement, always just beyond my peripheral vision. They seemed to flicker and disappear the moment I tried to focus, but I knew they were there, watching. I tried to steady myself. My instincts told me to run, but the desert wasn't a place to outrun anything. The very earth beneath my feet seemed to twist and turn as though the terrain itself was shifting, like the desert was closing in on me. There was no clear path forward, only more sand and the feeling of being relentlessly pursued by something that wasn't quite tangible. Every direction seemed wrong. A thought flitted across my mind, maybe the shadows weren't chasing me. Maybe they were leading me. But could I trust that? Could I trust my own instincts? The question kept swirling in my head, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't make sense of it. The line between the reality I once knew and the manipulation the aliens were putting me through had blurred beyond recognition. I took a step forward, my eyes scanning the horizon. The shadows were moving again, this time more defined, as if the darkness itself was alive and spreading across the land. I felt the weight of their presence on my back, growing heavier with each passing moment. There were no sounds of life, no insects, no animals, just the wind and the distant crackle of my breath in the dry air. I had learned to trust the silence. It was the only thing that didn't lie. But the shadows didn't feel like silence. They felt like a breach in that silence, a distortion of it. I should have been afraid of them. But somehow, I wasn't. I couldn't be sure if they were a part of me now, some extension of the confusion and paranoia the aliens had thrust upon me. I didn't know if they were something I should follow or run from. The air grew thick, charged with an unnatural energy. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, a drumbeat that echoed the distant hum I had started hearing, that eerie sound I had once dismissed as part of the desert's strange atmosphere. But now I understood, it wasn't the desert making that noise. It was them. The aliens. The hum was their signal, their calling card. They were manipulating every inch of this place, every shred of my existence, and I was losing my grip. I broke into a run, my legs moving without thinking, following the movement of the shadows. The more I ran, the more distorted the landscape became. The stars above me spun in chaotic circles, and the ground shifted beneath my feet. I could feel myself losing focus, could feel my mind breaking apart like brittle glass under the weight of the illusion they were casting around me. In the distance, I saw something flicker, like a mirage, but this time, I didn't hesitate. I ran toward it, driven by the instinct to escape, to find something real again. But as I got closer, the figure dissolved before my eyes, vanishing into thin air as though it had never been there at all. I stopped, gasping for breath, my chest heaving as panic surged through me. I was spiraling, my vision narrowing, my thoughts fractured into 1,000 pieces. I couldn't tell if I had been chasing a shadow or if the shadows had been chasing me. The line between them and me was fading, and soon I wouldn't be able to tell one from the other. Suddenly, the ground beneath me seemed to collapse, pulling me down. I stumbled, unable to regain my balance, my hands reaching out for something, anything, to hold on to. But there was nothing. Only darkness. Only the shifting, pulsing shadows that felt like they were pressing in from all sides. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. A voice. It wasn't my own, but it was in my head. You're running in circles. You've always been running. The voice wasn't a whisper this time. It was loud, like a crack in my mind. It was clear, resonating with an awful, terrible certainty. My vision spun again, and for a brief moment, everything around me stopped. The desert fell silent. The shadows froze. But just as quickly, everything resumed its relentless motion. And I couldn't tell if I was still running or if I had already become part of the illusion. My instincts screamed at me to keep moving, to push through the confusion, to fight the feeling that I was losing my mind. But the harder I tried to understand, the less I could trust anything. The shadows had become my reality, and the desert, with all its endless emptiness, was now the place where I would lose myself. There was no escape. No way out. I had been chasing shadows all along. And now, the shadows were chasing me. The desert had become a battleground between my fading will and the alien force that had been twisting everything around me. My thoughts were frayed, unraveling with each passing second, but one thing was clear, I couldn't run anymore. The aliens had made sure of that. They had turned the sand into a prison, and the sky above me into an endless watchful eye. They had crafted this nightmare, but I had learned enough. I knew enough to fight back. I felt the pressure of their presence, closing in from all sides, a weight in the air, thick with dread. I had tried to outwit them, tried to escape, but each time I thought I had found a way out, the desert shifted, the time distorted, and the shadows returned. But now, there was something else in me, an anger, a resolve that I hadn't had before. The fear was still there, lurking, but it no longer controlled me. I was tired of running, tired of being a victim in their twisted game. I took a deep breath, gathering every ounce of courage I had left. My eyes skimmed the horizon, still swirling with a mixture of darkness and the faint glow of starlight. The shadows were everywhere, moving silently, stalking me. But I wasn't alone. I knew they were there, just beyond the veil of reality, watching and waiting. I could almost feel their eyes on me, their invisible hands pulling at my thoughts. But this time, I wasn't afraid. I had seen enough. I had felt the distortions in time, the warping of space, the eerie hum that echoed through the sand. I knew their tricks, their manipulations. I had seen how they played with my memories, how they twisted my perceptions, feeding on my fear, my confusion. I had to make a stand. I reached into my pocket, pulling out the shard of metal I had taken from one of the abandoned campsites. It had no real power, no weapon-like qualities, but it felt solid in my hand, and in that moment, that solidity was all I needed. I held it tightly, not knowing what I was going to do with it, but knowing it was a symbol of resistance. A symbol of defiance. A sound interrupted my thoughts, soft at first, a faint buzzing like the hum of machinery. The air grew thick, charged, and the ground trembled beneath my feet. I looked around, but nothing was in sight. The sound was coming from all directions, filling the air like static. They were here. The aliens. I could feel their presence, like a vast, invisible weight pressing in from every angle. I braced myself, stepping forward into the sand, determined to face whatever was coming. And then, suddenly, the shadows took form. They solidified into shapes, figures, moving swiftly towards me. They were humanoid, tall and slender, with skin that shimmered like liquid metal, their faces obscured by a dark, almost fluid-like mask. They were the aliens, the ones who had been manipulating my mind, toying with me. I could hear their voices now, voices inside my head. Words that made no sense, yet carried the weight of something ancient, something terrifying. You cannot escape. You are ours. You have always been ours. I gripped the shard of metal tighter, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to focus. I had to block them out. They were trying to twist my thoughts again, trying to break me. But this time, I fought back. "You're wrong," I whispered, my voice barely audible against the hum of their presence. "I'm not yours. I'm not your plaything." The figures froze for a moment, as if surprised by my defiance. The shadows shifted, becoming more intense, pressing on me from all sides. The hum grew louder, vibrating through my bones. It felt like they were trying to invade my mind, to break my resolve. But I knew what I had to do. I closed my eyes for a brief second, taking in everything I had learned, the strange disturbances, the warping of time, the loss of memory. I wasn't the only one who had been affected. Other people had disappeared, only to return with shattered minds, memories stolen. They were testing us, manipulating us, using fear as their weapon. But fear wasn't the answer anymore. Understanding was. With a deep breath, I pushed my fear aside and focused on the alien energy surrounding me. I felt it, like an electric current running through the air. I reached out, not with my hands, but with my mind touching the hum, feeling its pulse. It was a connection, one they had been trying to establish all along. I knew it now. They fed on it, used it to control. But I had learned to block them out. And I would use their own power against them. The buzzing in my mind intensified, the shadows closing in as if to smother me, to drown me in their oppressive presence. But then something shifted. The energy I had been feeling, the hum, the pulse, it wasn't just theirs. It was mine too. It was my mind that had been twisted, my perception that had been manipulated. But now I could control it. I could feel the connection, and I could break it. I opened my eyes, looking directly at the alien figures. They were closer now, their masked faces blank and expressionless, but there was something in their movements that betrayed hesitation. They had underestimated me. They had underestimated us. I took a step forward, and the buzzing stopped. Silence fell over the desert, as if the very air had been sucked out of the world. The shadows flickered, then disappeared entirely, leaving behind only the stars and the desert. I felt my heart race as the last of their presence faded from my mind. I wasn't sure what had just happened, but I knew one thing for certain: I had broken their control. The desert, once filled with distortion and fear, now lay still. The sand was just sand again, the sky just the sky. I was free. At least for now. But even as I stood there, gasping for breath, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The aliens might be gone for now, but they had left a mark on me, a scar that would never fade. I had escaped the desert, but I wasn't sure I would ever escape them. The desert stretched out before me like a vast, empty canvas, its golden sands glittering under the weak morning sun. I could see the distant outline of the highway, the promise of escape, a way out of this nightmare. My legs felt like lead, and each step was a battle against the exhaustion that had overtaken my body and mind. I had escaped the aliens, for now. But I knew that the true escape wasn't just physical, it was mental, and that part of me was still trapped. The harsh desert wind bit at my skin as I stumbled toward the road, the faint hum of the desert's eerie silence following me like a shadow. It was almost as if the very earth was trying to hold me back, to pull me back into the depths of that fear-soaked nightmare I'd just barely escaped. The sand underfoot felt too solid, too real, like I was walking through a dream, unsure if I was really free or just trapped in another layer of their manipulation. I reached the road and flagged down a passing car, my heart thumping in my chest, but it was only when the vehicle stopped that I realized how much I had been holding my breath. The driver, a middle-aged man with a weathered face, looked at me with a mix of concern and confusion. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice calm but wary. I need to get out of here," I gasped, my voice hoarse, the weight of everything I had just experienced crashing over me like a wave. "Please, just take me anywhere. Away from here." The driver didn't hesitate. He nodded and opened the door, and I climbed into the passenger seat, my hands trembling as I fastened my seatbelt. I looked out the window as the car started moving, leaving the desert behind. But even as we drove, the unease never left me. The world outside the window was too calm, too ordinary. The green of the desert trees, the distant hum of the car engine, it felt like a dream, like I had slipped from one world into another. The memory of those figures, those aliens, their haunting, faceless presence, lingered in my mind, their cold voices still echoing in my ears. The desert had been their domain, but somehow it felt like they had left a piece of themselves inside me. Their touch was permanent, woven into the fabric of my mind. I couldn't forget. I couldn't escape that feeling. Hours passed, and as the car sped away from the desert's edge, I thought for a moment that I might finally be free. The sky was brighter here, the world more alive, and for a brief moment, I allowed myself to relax. I wanted to believe that it was over. I wanted to believe that the aliens had disappeared, that the nightmare I had lived through was just that, a nightmare. But then, something caught my eye. The road ahead was empty, and yet, in the rearview mirror, I saw them. Shadows. Flickering. Moving against the flow of the wind, against the movement of time. The same figures. They weren't gone. They hadn't left. They were still there, just out of sight, lurking in the edges of my mind. I flinched, my heart leaping into my throat. I looked at the driver, but he didn't seem to notice. He kept his eyes on the road, unaware of the unseen horrors that were now following me. I squeezed my eyes shut for a moment, trying to push the images away, trying to tell myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. The aliens hadn't left. They were still with me, in my thoughts, in my memories. They had branded me, and no matter how far I ran, I would never truly escape. I opened my eyes again and looked at the rearview mirror once more. The figures were gone. The road was empty. But the weight of what I had seen still pressed on me. I didn't know if they were following me, if they were somehow still in my mind, or if it was just the remnants of their manipulation. But I knew one thing for sure, the desert was behind me, but the alien presence wasn't. I tried to focus on the passing scenery, the mundane world outside the car. But every shadow, every flicker of light, every sound in the distance, it all seemed to carry a new weight. My mind, once sharp and clear, now felt dull, hazy, as if I was constantly being pulled back into that place where reality and fear collided. I had escaped, yes, but I had lost something in the process. The desert had left its mark, and no matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, I would always feel the pull of its grip on me. As the car continued on, the world outside finally feeling like it was returning to normal, I couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of isolation. The desert might have been behind me, but I wasn't sure I would ever truly leave it. I had survived. But my mind, my memories, were now a battlefield, haunted by the shadows of things I couldn't explain. The aliens hadn't just invaded my world, they had invaded me. And I was no longer sure who I was, or who I had been before the desert. The desert wasn't just a place. It was part of me now, and I feared it always would be. The familiar sights of home were supposed to bring me comfort. The weathered front door of the house, the old oak tree in the front yard, the overgrown garden that had always been a bit neglected, all of it should have been a relief after the horrors of the desert. But instead, it felt foreign, like I was walking into a place I didn't belong anymore. I stood on the porch, staring at the door, the cool breeze brushing against my face. It was a crisp evening, the kind that used to soothe me, but now it only heightened the sense of unease that had settled in my chest. Everything around me felt off, as though the world had shifted just slightly, and I hadn't been there to witness it. The edges of reality felt jagged, disconnected, and I wondered if the desert had left a permanent mark on me, if it had warped me beyond recognition. I reached for the door handle with a trembling hand, almost expecting it to resist, to fight back. But it opened easily, the hinges creaking in a way that I hadn't noticed before. I stepped inside, and the smell of old wood and dust hit me, familiar yet unsettling. I had lived here for years, but now it felt like a place I had never truly known. The silence inside was deafening. The house was still, as if holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I looked around, my gaze settling on the framed photos on the walls, family portraits, vacation snapshots, memories of a life I barely recognize now. Each picture seemed like a ghost of the past, a life that belonged to someone else. My heart raced as I moved further into the living room. The couch was still in its place, the bookshelf crammed with novels I had once read. But none of it felt real. I ran my fingers across the back of the couch, and the fabric felt too smooth, too artificial. I glanced toward the kitchen, half expecting to see someone there, waiting for me, but the room was empty. It should have been comforting, knowing that no one was here to confront me, but it only deepened my sense of isolation. I wanted to believe that I had escaped, that the alien force was behind me, lost in the desert. But a nagging thought wormed its way into my mind. What if it had followed me? What if I had never truly left? I took a step toward the kitchen, my feet heavy on the wooden floor, each movement slow and deliberate. I reached the counter and noticed a mug sitting there, half filled with coffee that had long since gone cold. It was a simple thing, a detail that might have gone unnoticed before, but now it made my stomach twist. The mug was too ordinary, too mundane. It was as if the house was pretending to be normal, pretending to be home. I reached out to pick it up, but my hand faltered before I touched the ceramic. It felt like I wasn't sure if I was allowed to touch it, like I wasn't allowed to be here at all. I pulled my hand back, and the sudden movement startled me, as though I had broken some unspoken rule. This is home, I told myself. This is where I belong. But the thought didn't feel true. I couldn't trust myself anymore, not after everything that had happened. The desert, the aliens, the distortions in my memory, it had all blurred together. I wasn't sure if I was still in that place, or if I had returned to the real world at all. The silence was growing louder now, pressing on me, suffocating me. I turned to look at the hallway leading to the bedrooms. The door to my room was cracked open, just a sliver, and I felt an overwhelming urge to go toward it. Maybe if I went to my room, if I could just see my bed, feel the comfort of my own space, things would start to make sense again. But as I took a step forward, I hesitated. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That my room wasn't mine anymore. That it hadn't been for a long time. I walked down the hallway, each step heavier than the last, until I reached the door. My hand hovered over the handle for a moment, my breath shallow, my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly, I pushed the door open. The room was exactly as I had left it. The bed was made, the nightstand cluttered with books and trinkets. But the air felt wrong. It was thick, like something was pressing against the walls, suffocating the space. I could almost hear the hum, faint but constant, like the vibration of a distant machine. I stepped inside, my eyes scanning the room, looking for any sign of disturbance. The floor was clean, the curtains drawn. But the longer I stood there, the more I felt as though something else had been here. Something that didn't belong. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed deeper than they should be, and the air felt charged with an energy I couldn't explain. A wave of dizziness swept over me, and I had to steady myself against the doorframe. My vision blurred, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something move, a flicker, a shadow shifting where there was no shadow before. I stepped back, my breath coming faster now, panic rising in my chest. The room felt like it was closing in on me, suffocating me, like I was no longer the person who had lived here. Like I was in a place that wasn't my own. I stumbled backward down the hallway, my mind spinning. This is home, I tried to remind myself, but the words felt hollow. The house had become a stranger to me, the familiar objects and sounds twisted by the fear in my chest. The desert had followed me here, and I was starting to realize that the real nightmare wasn't the aliens, it was the fact that I might never escape what they had done to me. I backed out of the house, slamming the door behind me. The air outside was cooler, and for a moment, I felt the faintest sense of relief. But the world around me was silent, too silent. The sky was the same, the streetlights flickering in the distance, but it felt wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed, that nothing would ever be the same again. I had come home, but it wasn't my home anymore, and I wasn't sure I could ever find my way back. The house felt even emptier now, despite being surrounded by the familiar objects I had once known. I wandered through the rooms, barely touching anything, as if I was afraid to disturb the fragile illusion that this was real. My mind was a fractured puzzle, and no matter how hard I tried, the pieces wouldn't fit together. What was real? What was part of the desert? I couldn't remember the exact sequence of events. The days felt like a haze, and I kept finding myself standing in places I didn't recall walking to. My footsteps echoed too loudly in the silence of the house, making everything feel more surreal. It was as if my past life had become a collection of broken fragments, each memory pulling me in different directions. I sat down in the living room, my eyes drifting over the shelves of books I had once cherished. But they were just books now, each spine a silent reminder of the life I had lost. I tried to think back to when I first arrived in the desert, to the day I started noticing the strange lights. I could almost see the scene in my mind, the desert stretching out before me under the vast sky. But the edges of that memory flickered, blurring and shifting. I couldn't hold on to it for long enough to understand. A shiver ran through me. My mind was playing tricks. I knew it, but that didn't make the feeling go away. I leaned back against the couch and shut my eyes, willing the thoughts to settle, to come into focus. But instead, all I saw were flashes, snippets of the desert, the flashes of light in the sky, the sense of being watched. And then there was a feeling of weightlessness, as though I was floating in a dark void. I reached for my phone, thinking I could at least look through my messages, try to ground myself in something concrete. But when I opened the screen, it was just a blur of notifications. The names didn't mean anything to me. The conversations were alien, filled with words I couldn't fully understand. I scrolled through the endless messages, each one more confusing than the last. Some were from people I barely remembered, others from people I didn't recognize at all. I froze when I saw a message from someone I should have known. My heart skipped a beat as I read it. "Are you okay? You've been gone for days." Days? My chest tightened. I had been back for hours, hadn't I? I looked around again, searching for something to anchor me, something to make sense of it all. But the walls of the house closed in, and the air felt thick, as though it were pressing on me from all sides. I tried to steady myself, focusing on the screen again. The dates didn't add up. I hadn't been gone for days. Had I? The last thing I clearly remembered was standing in the desert, the lights above me, the overwhelming sensation of being pulled toward them. But after that, everything was a blur. What happened to me? The answer was always just out of reach, hidden behind a veil of broken memories. I tried to recall the faces of the people I had known in the desert, but they were like shadows, flickering in and out of focus. There was a name I thought I knew, a person who might have been with me, someone who might have understood what was happening. But even their face was slipping away from me. Suddenly, the lights in the sky flashed back into my mind, sharp and bright. But there was something different about them now. They weren't just lights. They were eyes. No, not eyes. but something that watched, that observed. They hovered over the desert, unblinking, searching. I could almost feel them now, pressing into the corners of my consciousness. The more I tried to understand what had happened, the more they seemed to invade my thoughts. The idea of memory loss had never felt so real before. I had forgotten something important, something vital, and I couldn't get it back. The fear that I was still trapped there, in that same endless loop of terror, grew stronger. What if I hadn't escaped? What if the desert was still part of me, tangled deep within my mind? I forced myself to stand up, trying to push the intrusive thoughts away. I walked toward the window, hoping the act of looking outside might help me clear my head. The street was quiet, the night calm, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness beyond the glass held something waiting, something that had been waiting since I first set foot in the desert. My reflection stared back at me from the glass, but it wasn't quite right. There was a hollowness in my eyes, a vacancy that wasn't there before. My hands trembled as I touched the cold window pane, but I didn't look away. I needed to see something, anything, to prove that I was still here, still in control. The more I looked, the more the shadows seemed to shift behind me. I turned quickly, heart racing, but there was nothing there. Just the empty house, the flickering lights, the constant hum that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The truth was undeniable. I wasn't safe. Not here. Not anywhere. The desert had followed me home. And no matter where I went, no matter how hard I tried to piece together the truth, I would never escape what they had done to me. The memories I had, the ones I thought were mine, were slipping away like sand through my fingers. I wasn't sure who I was anymore. But I knew one thing, I was still trapped. I couldn't escape them. The whispers started soft, barely audible, like a distant murmur on the edge of my hearing. At first, I dismissed it as the wind or perhaps the hum of the refrigerator, something logical, something ordinary. But the longer I listened, the clearer it became. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the house. The sound was coming from inside my head. I froze in the kitchen, a half-drunk glass of water in my hand. I had just returned from the store, just another mundane task to remind me that I was still supposed to be normal, still supposed to fit into this world. But the moment I walked in, I could feel it. The shift. The air felt heavier, thick with something that wasn't there before. I could feel the presence, like a shadow lurking just beyond my vision. I tried to focus, to ignore the creeping dread in my chest, but then I heard it again. A voice, distant and faint, whispering my name. Help, help us. I dropped the glass. It shattered on the floor, the sharp sound cutting through the thick silence like a knife. I blinked, my heart hammering in my chest, but when I looked down, there was nothing, just the scattered shards of glass, glinting in the dim light. I didn't move for a long moment, not sure if I could trust myself to. The air was wrong, thick and suffocating, pressing against my lungs as if the walls were closing in. The sound of the glass breaking was drowned out by the pounding in my ears. My breath came shallow, my hands trembling. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just the after effects of everything that had happened in the desert. That I was still recovering from the trauma. But it didn't feel like recovery. It felt like a descent into something worse. I bent down to pick up the glass, but when my fingers brushed the cold shards, I saw it, just for a second, a flash, a face, distorted, half-formed, hovering just behind the reflection in the window. It wasn't my own face. It was someone else's. I jerked away, my breath catching in my throat. I looked again, but the reflection was mine, nothing more. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to force the vision from my mind, but when I opened them again, I could still hear the whispers. They were louder now, echoing from all corners of the house, curling into my thoughts like tendrils, pulling me back to that night, to the desert. Don't go. Please, stop. The words felt familiar, but I couldn't place them. I staggered back into the living room, clutching at the edges of the couch for support. My pulse was racing, and I felt dizzy, unsteady on my feet. It was happening again. It was happening here, in my own home. I pressed my palms against my ears, trying to block out the voices, but it didn't work. Instead, they grew louder, clearer. Images flashed through my mind, visions of the desert, of the lights above me, of the feeling of being watched. Then, something darker, the figure of a person, standing too still, their face hidden in shadow. The whispering voice called again, desperate, but its words were no longer coherent. I couldn't breathe. The walls seemed to close in tighter with each passing second. The desert had reached out to me, stretched its fingers across time and space, and pulled me back. I wasn't free. Not really. I staggered to the door, desperate for air, desperate for something to make sense of it all. I opened it wide, but the air outside didn't feel right either. The same oppressive weight hung over everything. The street was empty, the night too still, too silent. And yet I could feel it, the presence of something just beyond my reach. I could hear them, even now. You're not alone. The voice was different now, more insistent, more direct. It was inside my head, inside my thoughts. I didn't know if I was losing my mind or if it was something else. But I knew, deep down, I wasn't alone. The desert had followed me home. And it wasn't done with me yet. I stepped outside into the night, the familiar lights of the street lamps doing little to comfort me. The whispers continued, relentless, as though the desert itself had bled into the fabric of this place. My home had become a prison, every corner echoing with the past, with the memories I couldn't trust. The voices weren't just memories. They were real. Or they felt real, at least. I didn't know what was happening anymore, what was real and what was a trick of my fractured mind. All I knew was that I couldn't escape it. I turned and walked toward the darkness, my footsteps faltering with each step, but something inside me told me that no matter how far I ran, I would never truly be free. Not until the desert let go. And I wasn't sure if it ever would. It started subtly at first. A glance that lingered too long, a raised brow, the faintest hint of doubt in someone's voice when they asked me how I was doing. I thought I was imagining it, that it was just my own paranoia creeping in. But the looks became more frequent, the questions more pointed. Are you sure you're okay? You've been acting a little strange lately. It was my neighbor, Marie, who had known me for years. She looked at me with concern, but there was something in her eyes, something distant, as though she were talking to a stranger. The words were kind, but they carried a weight I couldn't shake. I'm fine, I said, forcing a smile that felt more like a mask than anything genuine. Just tired. She didn't seem convinced. Her eyes flickered down to the ground, and for a moment, I wondered if she could see it too, the cracks in my mind, the spaces where my memories should have been. But then, she looked away. She always did. I'll see you later, she said, and then she was gone. I didn't want her pity. I didn't want anyone's pity. The isolation was starting to seep in, like water into a crack in the stone, filling every gap with a creeping sense of loneliness. I wasn't the person I had been before. There was something wrong with me, something that I couldn't explain or put into words. I went to work the next day, a half-constructed version of myself. My coworkers barely looked at me, but when they did, I could feel the judgment in their eyes. I knew what they were thinking. I was the strange one now. The one who had come back from the desert, but hadn't really come back at all. What happened to you? That's what they were asking without saying it. It was written on their faces. And no matter how much I smiled, how much I tried to carry on with the routines I once knew so well, it didn't change the truth. I was broken. It wasn't just the people at work. It was everyone. My family, my friends, they all seemed to notice, but no one truly saw what had happened to me. I tried to talk to them about the whispers, about the shadows that followed me, but they just looked at me like I was crazy. They told me I needed rest, that I was overreacting. You're home now. It's over, my brother said one night, when I brought up the desert again, when I tried to explain the things I'd seen, the things I couldn't unsee. You're safe. You need to move on. Move on. As if it was that simple. As if the desert, the aliens, the nightmares would just vanish with the passing of time. I wanted to scream. I wanted to make them understand, to show them what I had been through. But the words never came out right. The more I tried to explain, the more they looked at me like I was losing my mind. You're just stressed, my mother said, her voice trembling with concern but also with something that almost sounded like frustration. You'll get better, honey. You just need to let go of all that stuff. The past is over. The past. But the past wasn't over. It was here, in my head, a constant presence that wouldn't let me forget. The shadows, the voices, the lights, it was all still there, inside me, gnawing away at whatever was left of my sanity. I wasn't sure how much longer I could hold on to reality. I stopped going out, stopped talking to people. I couldn't face them anymore. Every smile, every polite conversation felt like a lie, a mask that I wore to blend in, to pretend that I was okay. But I wasn't okay. I hadn't been okay since the desert. I started spending most of my time inside. The house felt like a prison, a place where I couldn't escape the constant reminders of what had happened. The windows were my only connection to the outside world, but every time I looked through them, I felt the weight of the desert pressing on me again. It was as if the landscape, the very air, had a way of creeping into my home, filling every corner with the fear and confusion I had left behind. And then the dream started. I couldn't remember when it began, but it had to have been after the night I tried to talk to my brother. The dreams were like a portal, dragging me back to that place. The desert. The lights. The sense of being watched, of being taken. I would wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, but the fear lingered. I could still hear the whispers. Still feel the pull of the desert, as though it was reaching out to claim me again. I would lie awake at night, the darkness pressing against my chest, and wonder if anyone cared. If anyone could see what was happening to me. But I knew the truth, no one could. No one would. They had all moved on. They had all forgotten. And I was left alone, stranded in a world that no longer made sense. The more I tried to explain, the more isolated I became. No one understood. No one cared. I was starting to wonder if they were right, if I was losing my mind. Or maybe the desert had gotten to me in ways I couldn't understand, twisting my perception of reality until nothing felt real anymore. All I knew for sure was that I was alone. And I wasn't sure if there was anything left to save. I couldn't escape it. The weight of it all, of everything I had seen, everything I had lost, felt like it was crushing me from the inside out. I tried to focus on the small things, the smell of coffee in the morning, the routine of brushing my teeth, checking the mail. But it didn't work. The normalcy felt false, a thin veil covering something far darker that I couldn't shake. My hands shook as I reached for the mug, spilling some of the coffee over the rim. I didn't care. The world around me felt like it was slipping through my fingers, unraveling, piece by piece. I tried to breathe, to calm myself, but the air felt too thin, too heavy. I closed my eyes, just for a moment, but that was all it took. The memories rushed back, sharp, vivid, like they were happening all over again. The lights in the sky, flickering like distant stars, drawing me in with an unnatural pull. The feeling of being watched, the sudden chill of the night air, the way the ground beneath me had shifted, almost as if the desert was alive, moving, changing. And then the voices. They hadn't stopped. They were always there, just beneath the surface, whispering to me in the quiet moments when my guard was down. I couldn't make out the words anymore, but I could feel them, scraping against my mind like nails on a chalkboard. The more I tried to ignore them, the louder they became. "Stop it," I whispered to myself, my voice barely audible in the empty room. But they didn't stop. They never stopped. I could still hear the pleading, the cries for help. I could still see their faces, the lost, the forgotten. The ones who had disappeared, only to return with broken minds and shattered memories. Had they heard it too? Were they feeling this? Was I just like them now? The thought sent a wave of panic through me. I was starting to lose track of what was real and what was them. How long would it take before the line between the two disappeared completely? I stood, my legs unsteady, and stumbled toward the window. I had to see outside. I had to ground myself in something, anything, to remind myself that I was still here, that I wasn't just a figment of my own imagination. But when I looked out, I saw the shadows again. The same ones from the desert, stretching across the yard, long and dark in the dim light. I blinked, and they were gone. No. I couldn't do this. I couldn't keep living like this. I walked to the door, my hands trembling, and stepped outside. The cool night air hit me like a slap to the face, but it didn't help. It wasn't real. None of it was. It was all a trick, a game they were playing with my mind. I heard a sound, a footstep behind me, soft but distinct, like someone or something was following. I whirled around, my heart pounding, but the yard was empty. The street was quiet. Too quiet. They're here. They're always here. The thought whispered through my mind, chilling me to the core. I wanted to scream, to tear at my skin and wake up from this nightmare. But I couldn't. The terror was so ingrained in me now that it felt like part of me, an infection I couldn't shake. I had tried to tell myself it was just trauma, just the result of what I had experienced. But the truth was harder to face. The truth was that I was being watched. That I had never really left the desert. No matter how far I ran, no matter how many walls I built around myself, they were still there, just out of sight, slipping through the cracks of my mind. I could feel them closing in, even now. The alien presence that had once been distant and abstract was becoming more tangible, more real with every passing moment. Their influence had wormed its way into me, twisting my thoughts, altering my perception until I couldn't trust anything. Not the reflections in the mirror. Not the sound of my own voice. Not even the ground beneath my feet. I felt something inside me snap. I dropped to my knees, my body racked with the force of the panic that had consumed me. The whispers were louder now, no longer distant, but pressing against my mind, urging me to listen, to understand. I didn't know if I could take it anymore. "I'm still here," I whispered through clenched teeth. "I'm still here." But it didn't feel like I was. It didn't feel like I was me anymore. The desert had taken that from me. The aliens had twisted it, reshaped it into something unrecognizable. I couldn't remember what it felt like to be normal, to be whole. I looked around the empty yard, but I could no longer be sure of anything. Had I ever been here before? Was this my house? My life? Or had it all been a lie? I clutched my head in my hands, trying to push the thoughts away, but they kept coming, overwhelming me, crashing through my defenses like a flood. I heard the footsteps again. Closer this time. And this time, when I turned, I wasn't alone. There was a figure standing at the edge of the yard, just outside the light. Tall, shadowy, like a silhouette made of darkness. I couldn't see its face, but I didn't need to. I could feel it. It was watching me. Just like before. Just like always. The fear seized me, paralyzing me, but I couldn't look away. I could not look. I felt it, the undeniable truth that they were still here. Watching. Waiting. And I was nothing more than a piece in their game. It had been months since I returned, months since I thought I had left it all behind. The desert, the lights, the memories, all of it seemed to fade, like a nightmare at the edge of dawn. I convinced myself I was safe, that the alien presence had been nothing more than a product of trauma and fear. But the moment I heard it, I knew. A disturbance. A new report, just like the old ones. The familiar flicker of panic stirred inside me as I sat in front of the television, my eyes glued to the screen as the newscaster's voice echoed through the living room. Authorities are investigating several strange disappearances in the Arizona desert. Locals have reported unusual lights in the sky, lights that disappear as quickly as they appear. No trace of the missing persons has been found. Theories range from alien abductions to natural phenomena. My breath caught in my throat. Alien abductions. The words hit me like a slap, as though I had been transported back in time to the heart of the nightmare I thought had escaped. I gripped the armrest of the chair, trying to steady my racing heart. The lights. The people. The disappearances. I had spent so long convincing myself it wasn't real, that I was just a broken mind trying to make sense of the chaos. But now I wasn't sure anymore. Had I truly left the desert? Had I ever really escaped? The lights. I hadn't seen them again, not in person, but I knew. I knew they were still out there, just beyond the horizon, waiting, watching. The newscaster spoke of the missing people, their faces flashing on the screen, young, old, families, strangers. All gone, without a trace. The reports were eerily similar to the ones that had haunted the airwaves during my time in the desert. But what if it wasn't just a coincidence? What if the aliens had never stopped? What if I had only been one of many, their experiments spanning decades, reaching far beyond the small stretch of desert where I had been? I stood up suddenly, the room spinning as I tried to steady myself. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I couldn't pretend I hadn't heard the whispers that followed me home. The strange sounds in the night. The shadows that lingered in the corners of my vision. They were still out there. I felt it in my bones. But was I going crazy? Had I truly seen what I thought I saw? The memory of the desert, the lights, the figures, the silence felt like a dream. A nightmare I couldn't wake from. But the report, the disappearances. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog that clouded my thoughts. Focus. I walked to the window, the night air pressing against the glass. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help myself. I had to know. And there it was. The faintest glimmer. A flash of light in the distance, high above the desert hills. A shimmer that moved in a way no ordinary light should. I froze. My breath hitched in my chest. Could it be? The light danced across the sky, too far to reach, but unmistakable. The aliens. They were out there. They hadn't gone. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't imagining it. The desert had never let me go. But something else clawed at me, a thought that chilled me even more than the sight of that light. What if it was never just about the desert? I turned from the window, my pulse racing. I had to find out. This couldn't just be another random report. This couldn't be a coincidence. The aliens were real, they had been real, and they were still out there. Somewhere. But why? Why had they chosen us? Why had they done this to me? To all of us? I needed answers. And this time, I wouldn't run. I couldn't. I couldn't breathe. The light outside, the flashes in the desert, they seemed to call to me, but everything else, everything was slipping away. I gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white, trying to steady myself, but the dizziness refused to relent. My thoughts felt like they were spinning out of control, tugged in different directions by the same haunting questions that had been following me since my return. What if it wasn't real? The doubt began as a whisper, a tiny seed in the back of my mind, but it grew, twisting around my thoughts like an uncontrollable vine. Was it all a dream? A shared hallucination? Or had I truly experienced the terror in that desert, the lights, the loss, the figures in the shadows? The longer I stared at the window, the more the lights in the distance seemed like a trick of my eyes. Could it be? Could the whole thing have been something my mind invented? A coping mechanism to deal with the trauma I had endured? I sank down into a chair, my head spinning. The reports on the television had brought it all rushing back, but as the flashes of the desert filled my thoughts, they began to feel distant, faded, like they were someone else's memories, not my own. The lights, the figures, had I truly seen them? Or had I simply imagined it, twisted by fear and isolation? I closed my eyes and rubbed my temples, trying to force the memories to be clear, to be solid. But they weren't. They were fragmented, disjointed, slipping through my fingers every time I tried to grasp them. Faces, shapes, whispers, all jumbled together in a blur of confusion. I couldn't remember what was real anymore. What if I had just been insane? The thought echoed in my head, relentless, until it drowned out everything else. I had spent so much time convincing myself I was sane, that the fear wasn't real, that the aliens, whatever they were a product of my mind. But now I wasn't so sure. I stood up abruptly, pacing the room, trying to make sense of the mess of thoughts inside my head. Could I trust my memories? How could I know if anything that happened had been real? I had seen people disappear, had felt the ground shift beneath my feet, heard the sounds of something other lurking just beyond my reach. But what if that was just my mind breaking? What if it was all just a product of isolation, of fear? Could a person truly lose themselves like that? Maybe it was all just a dream. The thought was like a heavy weight pressing down on me. Could I have imagined it all? Could the lights, the disappearances, the terror, all just have been my mind playing tricks on me after weeks alone in that desert? I staggered to the window again, staring out into the dark. The desert was still out there, vast and silent, but now it felt like something alien, something I didn't know anymore. The lights had vanished. I couldn't see them. Was it just a fog of my own mind, playing tricks on me? I wasn't sure what to believe. The fear that had gnawed at my bones, the memories of the strange occurrences, they felt so real. But now everything felt too distant, too fractured. What was I supposed to do with this uncertainty? What if I was losing my grip on reality, falling into madness like so many before me? I had heard of people breaking after traumatic events, of their minds fracturing, creating alternate realities to escape the horrors they couldn't bear. Was this what was happening to me? Was I becoming one of them? Had it all been a hallucination, a collective delusion born from the isolation and terror? But then, the faintest sound reached my ears. A whisper in the wind, distant but familiar. Something I had heard before. I turned sharply, but the room was empty. No one was there. I felt my heart pound in my chest, the panic rising again. The lights were gone, the desert was still, but the whisper lingered. Was it real? Had it come from outside? Or was it just my mind taunting me once again, blurring the line between truth and insanity? My legs felt weak, and I stumbled back to the chair, my hands shaking. The doubt was consuming me, pulling me into the same spiral I had been in all along. Was I still in the desert? Was I still trapped in that game? Or had I truly escaped? I couldn't stay here any longer. The walls of my house felt like a prison, the silence pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't shake off. Every night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the presence of something just beyond my grasp. It had been years since I first left the desert, but the memories still lingered, as fresh and sharp as they were on the day I fled. And now, with the reports of new disappearances, the whispers in the dark, the lights flickering in my mind, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to go back. It wasn't logical. It didn't make sense. But there was no other way. If I truly wanted to understand, to find closure, to know what had really happened to me, to the people who vanished, to the ones who returned changed, then I had to face it once more. The desert had taken so much from me, and I had tried to escape. I had tried to leave it behind, but it followed me, never letting go. The fear, the confusion, the lights, the whispers. They were still out there, still waiting. So I packed what little I needed and drove, driving back toward the same barren stretch of land that had become the scene of my nightmare. The road stretched endlessly in front of me, a ribbon of asphalt that seemed to lead nowhere, much like the path I had been following in my own mind. As I neared the desert's edge, a deep, unsettling feeling settled in my chest. Was I doing the right thing? Was this going to be the end of my torment, or was I walking straight into my own destruction? There were so many questions, so many things I didn't understand. But the answers were here. Somewhere. The sun began to set, casting long shadows over the empty landscape. The familiar, eerie stillness of the desert wrapped around me, and I pulled off the road, parking my car where I had parked so many times before. The wind whispered across the sand, and for a moment, I just stood there, staring at the vast emptiness ahead. It was as though the desert itself was waiting for me, silent and patient. I had been here before. I had walked through this exact place, my heart filled with terror, my mind screaming to escape. But now, I was different. I was stronger, more determined. I had to confront the truth, whatever it was. With a deep breath, I began to walk. Each step felt heavier, as though the sand beneath my feet was pulling me deeper into the earth, into the heart of the mystery. The wind picked up, swirling around me, carrying with it a strange, almost familiar hum. The same hum I had heard that night, all those years ago. I paused, my heart racing. There it was again. The light. At first, it was just a flicker in the distance, a small, distant glow. But then it grew, expanding, twisting, like something alive. The glow pulsed with an unnatural rhythm, and the air grew thick, heavy, almost suffocating. I stood frozen, torn between the urge to run and the need to understand. It was them. The aliens. They hadn't disappeared. They had been here all along, lurking in the shadows, waiting. I moved closer, my feet carrying me with a force that felt beyond my control, drawn to the light. The closer I got, the more the landscape seemed to shift. The sand beneath my feet trembled, and the air crackled with static. I could feel the ground moving, like it was alive, like the earth itself was part of their scheme. And then, as I reached the epicenter of the glow, it all stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Total, suffocating silence. And then, the figure emerged. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything I had ever seen before. The being was tall, its form shimmering like smoke, shifting and undulating, almost as if it wasn't fully present in this reality. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were vast and empty, swirling with stars, like windows into another universe. It didn't move toward me. It simply watched. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my body trembling with a mixture of fear and awe. My mind screamed to run, to escape, but I couldn't. It was as though I had been pulled into something much bigger than myself, something that transcended everything I had ever known. And then, in the deepest recesses of my mind, I heard it. "You've come back, but for what?" The voice was not spoken aloud. It didn't need to be. The words were in my head, in my soul, like an intimate, intrusive thought. It was as if the being had access to my very essence, my deepest fears, my most private thoughts. I didn't respond at first. How could I? What was there to say? I had come back to find answers, but now that I was here, faced with the truth, I realized I didn't even know what the right questions were. The alien's gaze seemed to pierce through me, and I felt it, the truth. The desert. The lights. The disappearances. The experiments. All of it had been orchestrated, not just by them, but by something larger, something beyond even their control. The aliens were just the messengers, the agents, testing humanity in ways we could never comprehend. But then, the being did something unexpected. It moved, slowly and deliberately, and for the first time, I felt the pull of its influence, the weight of its presence. It stretched its long arm out, not to hurt, but to share something. In an instant, the memories rushed into me, terrifying visions of what I had experienced, but now they made sense. The hallucinations, the lost time, the twisted memories. They were not just my own, but a part of a larger experiment. I had been chosen, not by chance, but because I was one of many. And then, the truth hit me harder than any fear I had ever known. We were the experiment. The alien didn't need to say it aloud. I understood. My mind raced with the implications. We had all been subjects in an experiment beyond human comprehension. And now, we were waking up, piece by piece, slowly realizing the truth. But the truth came at a cost. The being withdrew its hand, and with a final, haunting glance, it vanished into the air, the glow fading with it. I stood alone in the desert once more, but I wasn't the same. Nothing was the same. The truth was too much to bear. The reality I had known before had shattered. I wasn't sure what to do next, what to believe, but one thing was certain: the desert had given me the answers I had so desperately sought. And yet, I wasn't sure I could live with what I now knew. The moment the alien disappeared, I felt an overwhelming emptiness settle in. My mind spun with the weight of what had just occurred, but it was more than that. It was the truth I had uncovered, the truth that would haunt me for the rest of my life. We weren't just random subjects to them. The aliens hadn't come to Earth for some fleeting curiosity. No, we were part of something much larger. They had chosen us, not because they were interested in our species, but because we were tools. Tools for something bigger, a grand experiment that stretched beyond the confines of this planet and into the very fabric of reality itself. I stood in the desert, the sand shifting under my feet like it had a life of its own. The glow from earlier had disappeared, but the silence that followed was thick and oppressive, as if the air itself was holding its breath. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel my senses sharpening, listening for any sound, any movement. The alien had shown me the truth, but it was too much. Too much to understand, too much to process. They had been manipulating us, not just through memory loss, hallucinations, and disappearance, but through our very perceptions of reality. Our minds had been altered, twisted into an intricate puzzle we couldn't solve because the rules of this reality weren't the same as we thought they were. I tried to grasp at the fragments of memory the being had flooded into me. 1,000 images, 1,000 thoughts, and yet they didn't fit together. It was like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle scattered across a vast landscape, too many, too disjointed, too alien to form a whole picture. The more I tried to understand, the more my mind slipped away from the grasp of reason. I remembered a flash of darkened skies, of flashes of light, of the strange hum that had once reverberated in the air like the pulse of the earth itself. And then, I understood. The experiments they conducted on us weren't just about studying human beings, they were about manipulating our very perception of existence. They had twisted our understanding of time, space, and memory. They had created a pocket of reality within the desert where the rules didn't apply, where our minds could be shaped and reshaped. They weren't just experimenting with us, they were playing with the fabric of our existence. The alien presence had made one thing crystal clear: they had been testing the limits of human consciousness, pushing us to the edge, seeing how much we could endure. What we saw, what we remembered, even the fear we felt, it was all part of their design. Our thoughts, our memories, our emotions were nothing but data to them. And worse still, we had become part of something greater. The aliens were not isolated in their goals, they were merely the agents of an unknown force, a far-reaching intelligence that spanned not just galaxies, but dimensions, realities, beyond our own. We were pawns in an experiment that reached across time and space, a twisted game played by an intelligence that saw us as insignificant. The more I thought about it, the more the horror deepened. They had been preparing us for something. Preparing us for a purpose we couldn't even begin to fathom. Our minds had been altered to the point where we would never be able to fully escape. The hallucinations, the missing time, the strange lights, they were not accidents. They were tools, part of a larger design to unravel our understanding of the world. I felt sick. A knot of dread twisted in my stomach as I realized the truth. they had never truly left. Their presence was all around us, embedded into the very fabric of our world. They were not just in the desert, they were everywhere. The boundaries between dimensions, between realities, were paper thin. And the aliens had been pushing at those boundaries, nudging them further until they had infiltrated everything. We were living in a world shaped by their influence, by their experiments, and we had no idea. I wanted to scream, to run, to wake up, but there was nowhere to go. There was no escape. I was trapped, not just in the desert, but in a reality that was no longer mine. My mind began to fracture under the weight of it all, and I felt the all too familiar sensation creeping over me that something was watching, waiting, lurking just beyond the veil of perception. I looked around, searching for any sign of life, any hint that I was still connected to the world I had once known. But the desert remained empty, silent. The stars above twinkled in a way that seemed almost mocking, as if they knew the truth but refused to reveal it to me fully. I stumbled backward, my vision swimming as the weight of this revelation pressed down on me. I could no longer trust my senses. What was real? What wasn't? Had the aliens ever truly left, or had they simply woven themselves deeper into the fabric of our reality? I didn't have answers. I didn't have control. And then, just as I thought I might lose myself completely, I saw it again, the light. It appeared from the distance, faint at first, like a star breaking through the dark horizon. But as it grew, it became clear that it wasn't natural. It pulsed with an otherworldly energy, its shape shifting in ways that defied logic. The same light I had seen years ago, the one that had haunted me, the one that had pulled me into this twisted reality. The desert wasn't just a place, it was a gateway. The aliens hadn't just experimented on us, they had created something far worse. They had opened a rift, a breach between worlds. The lights were not just signals. They were portals. I felt the overwhelming compulsion to walk toward it, to step into it. Maybe it would give me the answers I had been searching for, or maybe it would finally end this nightmare. But as I moved closer, I realized there would be no end. Not for me. Not for anyone. The aliens had set this all in motion, and we were no longer just pawns. We were part of it, part of the experiment, part of their reality. And as the light enveloped me, I understood. The desert had never been an isolated place. It had always been connected. Connected to them. To it. And now, there was no turning back. The light pulsed around me, its glow swallowing the desert in a wash of brilliant, sickly hues. It was no longer just a flicker in the distance, it was here, all around me, consuming the air, distorting everything. The sky, the sand, the very ground beneath my feet seemed to bend and warp, as if the rules of existence themselves were unraveling at the seams. I couldn't stop myself. My feet moved forward, drawn by an invisible force, compulsion flooding my every step. Was I walking towards salvation, or had I become nothing more than a moth flying into the flame? There was no longer any certainty in my thoughts, no clear line between what I feared and what I desired. And then, as I crossed the threshold of the light, something changed. A sudden pressure, a weight that felt like it was pressing down on my soul, surrounded me. The air was thick with an energy that hummed through my body, sending shivers down my spine. It wasn't a place anymore. It was a thing, alive and conscious, pulling at me, shaping me. I staggered, as my vision blurred. The world around me twisted further, folding into itself. The desert, the sky, everything vanished, leaving behind only this endless, suffocating void. It was like being suspended in the in-between, a space where time did not exist, where nothing had form. I heard them before I saw them, the whispers. Soft at first, like a distant breeze, but soon louder, a cacophony of voices, many overlapping, distorted. The aliens. They had been watching, waiting for this moment. But this time, their presence was different. It was direct, suffocating. They weren't simply manipulating the environment. They were in my head. Their thoughts, their designs, their cold, calculating purpose poured into my mind like a flood. "You are part of the process now," one of them said, its voice a thousand voices woven together into something unintelligible but chillingly clear. "The experiment continues. You are the subject, but you have also become the observer. You will see all, know all, but you will never escape." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My body felt paralyzed, as though I was trapped in some sickening limbo between reality and nightmare. The more I struggled, the more my mind splintered. The memories, the hallucinations, the madness, they all started to blend together, swirling in an endless loop. I had no control. And then, just as quickly as it had come, the light vanished. I found myself standing back in the desert, the night sky stretching endlessly above me. But it wasn't the same desert. The air was thick, the world had a strange, unnatural stillness. The landscape was altered, and I could feel the weight of it. Everything seemed off. The shadows were wrong, too long, too sharp. The wind whispered a language I couldn't understand. But the worst part was the silence. The profound silence. And the feeling that I wasn't alone. I turned, and there, standing just beyond my reach, was a figure. It was human, but it wasn't. It was me. Or at least, it looked like me. The same face, the same body. But the eyes, those eyes were empty. Hollow. Cold. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Panic gripped me as the figure began to walk toward me, its movements unnatural, jerky. My heart raced in my chest as it closed the distance. "You will always return," the figure whispered, its voice no longer mine but something darker, more hollow. "There is no escape. You are forever here." The world around me began to fracture again. The reality I knew was slipping through my fingers, and in its place, a new reality took form, one I couldn't understand, one that had no rules, no logic. It was their world now, and I was just a part of it, an unknowing player in a game where the rules had never been mine to know. The last thing I saw before the darkness consumed me was the sky above, once more alive with the same strange lights. The same lights that had started this all. But now, there was no question, they were not just lights. They were the eyes of something watching, something waiting. And in that final moment, I understood the truth. There was no escape, no resolution. The desert was not just a place, it was a doorway. And I had crossed it, unknowingly, irrevocably, becoming part of something far worse than I could have ever imagined. I was no longer the subject of their experiment. I was the experiment. Forever. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.